You were laughing. That was the problem. 101 moments where funny flipped to fatal so fast the camera was still rolling. Starting now. 1. The dentist chair feels like a comedy. Set the moment someone gets nitrous oxide and starts narrating their own face. You've seen the videos. You've shared them. You've sent them to people who needed a laugh on a rough Tuesday. But here's what you weren't told while you were watching. Nitrous oxide is a dissociative anesthetic, and it works by temporarily severing your brain's ability to form new memories while simultaneously processing pain signals at a fraction of normal capacity. The loopy behavior you're watching and rating 10 out of 10 is the same physiological state as early-stage anesthesia overdose. The line between the funny video and the medical emergency is not a wall, it's a hair. Without supplemental oxygen, nitrous causes displacement that can trigger hypoxia within minutes. In unmonitored recreational settings, it kills dozens of people annually, most of them young and otherwise healthy, through simple asphyxiation. Long-term or repeated exposure depletes vitamin B12 at a rate that causes irreversible neurological damage, including paralysis. The patient looked like a comedic gold mine. What they were actually experiencing was a temporary, controlled malfunction of their central nervous system. You filmed it. You called it content. The medical term for what was happening was something considerably less shareable. 2. A century of slapstick has told you that a blow to the groin is the universal language of comedy. The double over, the slow crumple, the face that briefly achieves a new emotional frequency. It's been in films since films existed, and it has never once stopped being funny, to approximately everyone except the person it happened to. But the groin region is not a reset button. A significant impact to that area can cause testicular torsion, which is exactly what it sounds like, and which becomes a surgical emergency the moment it occurs. You have a window of 4 to 6 hours to get the organ into an operating room before the blood supply is permanently cut off. After 12 hours, the salvage rate drops below 10%. That's not a medical footnote. That's a countdown clock that started when the studio audience started laughing. A severe strike can also rupture the testicle outright, which carries a rupture rate of approximately 50% in high-impact cases. And then there's the vagus nerve response, which can cause genuine, involuntary loss of consciousness from the neurological signal alone, not the pain. The crowd thought they saw a comedy beat. The anatomy was running an entirely different program. 3. Someone goes pale and hits the floor, and the room does that thing where it gasps and then starts laughing because they got up and waved. Classic. Happens all the time. Probably fake. Probably fine. It's always fine. Except for the roughly 25% of fainting episodes, where the underlying cause is a cardiac arrhythmia, which is not fine, and which does not announce itself as the dangerous kind before the person drops. Syncope is a symptom, not a punchline, and the body does not color code the addition you're watching. A sudden cardiac arrest can be preceded by a brief syncopal episode that is visually indistinguishable from the comedy version. The American Heart Association estimates that 1 in 300 competitive athletes carries a structural heart abnormality capable of manifesting first as exactly this kind of fall. There's also convulsive syncope, where the body produces brief, seizure-like movements during the faint, which bystanders reliably describe as the person being dramatic or clowning around, which reliably delays the emergency response. And even when the heart is fine, the floor is not. A person who faints without warning has zero ability to brace. The skull meets the ground at full deadweight velocity. You waited for the bow. The clock was running on a different agenda entirely. 4. Drunk people falling down is comedy's oldest material. The wobble. The slow-motion negotiation with gravity. The spectacular loss of the argument. People have been filming this since phones had cameras. And before that, people just told the story at every family gathering for the next 11 years. But acute alcohol intoxication is the primary cause of accidental death in adults under 45 in most developed countries. And the majority of those deaths are preceded by moments that the people present described afterward as funny, or not that serious, or something they thought he'd walk off. The gag reflex gets suppressed past a blood alcohol content of roughly 0.25, which means the person who's passed out face up is now managing their own airway with equipment that's been temporarily taken offline. People die this way every year in rooms full of other people. Around 2,200 Americans die from alcohol poisoning annually, most of them in the presence of others who made the call to let them sleep it off. Then there's the floor impact. Alcohol thins the blood and eliminates the fall-breaking reflex simultaneously, so the head hits harder and bleeds longer. And 50 degrees outside with wet clothes is hypothermia territory within 2 hours. You captioned it with a laughing emoji. The mechanism didn't care. 5. A kid puts something disgusting in their mouth on a dare. The room erupts. And someone's already reaching for their phone to capture the second act. It's innocent. It's childhood. It's probably fine, because kids eat dirt and survive. And that's basically the whole premise of childhood. But children's airways are anatomically narrower than adults, and their gag reflex response under social pressure is significantly less reliable than it is when no one's watching and cheering. Choking is the 4th leading cause of accidental death in children under 5, and a number of those incidents happened in social settings where adults were present and initially read the child as being dramatic. The dare-eating format adds a pressure layer that encourages the child to keep going, past the point where the body is sending clear objection signals. Aspiration pneumonia, where food or liquid enters the lungs rather than the stomach, can develop hours after an ingestion event with 0 immediate symptoms, meaning the danger is completely invisible during the funny part of the evening. Raw flour, one of the more common gross dare items, contains active bacteria, including E. coli, capable of causing serious systemic illness. The dare lasted 8 seconds. The pediatric emergency room visit lasted considerably longer and contained significantly fewer laughs. 6. Every holiday weekend produces the same content. A rocket goes sideways. Someone's lawn chair is briefly on fire. A person runs in circles, and the assembled crowd films it in portrait mode with maximum enthusiasm. It's beloved chaos. It's practically a seasonal tradition at this point. The United States Consumer Product Safety Commission documents approximately 10,000 fireworks-related emergency room visits every single year, with the highest injury concentrations packed into the same 2-week window that everyone treats as the high point of summer entertainment. Sparklers, the item handed to children at every backyard event because they're the safe option, burn at approximately 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt gold. They cause more pediatric burns than any other category of consumer fireworks, and they do it while everyone's watching and agreeing they're the responsible choice. Mortar-style fireworks that misfire at ground level generate concussive blast pressure, capable of rupturing eardrums and causing traumatic brain injury in bystanders who had no involvement in the launch decision. A firework that appears to be a dud has an industry-recognized hazard window of at least 20 minutes before anyone should approach it. Most people give it about 45 seconds. 3 of the 200,000 people who watched that viral clip watched it from a hospital bed. 7. Icefall footage is the internet's most dependable delivery system for schadenfreude. The windmill arms, the hang time, the catastrophic negotiation with a surface that gave no warning and 0 quarter. People rate the form, debate the landing, and move on with their day. What you're watching is the body's last-ditch attempt to survive an impact that the nervous system has already determined it cannot prevent, because the average icefall takes 300 milliseconds from foot slip to ground contact, and no human nervous system can consciously react and intervene in that window. Hip fractures from falls on ice carry a 1-year mortality rate of up to 30% in adults over 50. The wrist fracture, the most common outcome, happens because the reflex to catch yourself with outstretched hands is neurologically automatic and cannot be suppressed, so the full force of a backward falling body goes directly into the radius. Occipital skull fractures from backward falls are particularly ugly because the back of the skull is thinner than the front. The impact often leaves no visible mark, and the intracranial bleeding starts quietly and presents as a crisis well after the moment everyone found entertaining. Spinal compression fractures from ice falls can develop with no immediate pain at all. You rated the animation. The radiology report had a different set of priorities. 8. Somebody gets flung at an unexpected angle off a trampoline or a bungee setup. The crowd flinches and then loses it, and everyone agrees it was the best part of the afternoon because they landed on the grass and got up looking confused. Trampoline-related injuries send approximately 100,000 Americans to emergency rooms every single year. The most severe category isn't the dramatic fall. It's the spinal cord damage, which disproportionately affects children and adolescents who appear to land in completely normal ways. The double bounce, where two people jump simultaneously and transfer energy into one jumper, can generate impact forces at landing equivalent to a fall from a second-story window. Cervical spine fractures from trampoline incidents occur most often when a jumper lands on their head or neck during a failed flip attempt. A number of those fractures have produced permanent quadriplegia in otherwise healthy teenagers, and they all looked like regular trampoline footage right up until the landing. Internal organ bruising from high-impact trampoline contact, particularly to the liver and spleen, can be completely asymptomatic for 24 to 48 hours before becoming a life-threatening internal bleed. The crowd saw a successful stunt that went slightly wrong. The MRI the next morning had a more specific description of what actually happened. 9. Someone rushes a stage or a field. The crowd roars, security gives chase, and for about 30 seconds everyone agrees this is the best unscripted thing that's happened all year. It's spontaneous. It's human. It's practically a tradition at this point, and the security tackle is half the entertainment. Unauthorized stage and field intrusions have triggered fatal stampedes. They have caused documented cardiac stress responses in performers whose bodies cannot biologically distinguish between a fan and an assailant, regardless of the intent being broadcast to 30,000 people in the stands. The security tackle that gets filmed, captioned, and shared as slapstick has produced broken limbs, concussions, and in one documented case, a spinal injury to the person being apprehended. The legal consequences have escalated sharply in recent years, and what reads as a spontaneous comedy moment can result in felony charges and multi-year sentences depending on which side of which jurisdiction line you were standing on when you made the decision. The crowd saw the beginning of the story. The liability team, the trauma surgeon, and the prosecuting attorney were each working on a different chapter simultaneously, and none of their chapters were labeled the fun part. 10. Sneaker wave footage is one of the internet's most shared categories of coastal content, and the format is always the same. Person standing at the water's edge, looking the wrong way, absolute wall of water, spectacular obliteration, person surfaces sputtering, everyone is thrilled. The United States Geological Survey has documented sneaker waves on Pacific coastlines that generated enough force to move boulders weighing several tons. A standing human offers approximately no resistance to that physics. Cold water shock from sudden immersion in ocean water below 60 degrees. Fahrenheit triggers immediate hyperventilation and can cause cardiac arrest in otherwise healthy individuals because the body's gasp reflex initiates drowning within the first minute before the person has processed what's happening or begun to panic. Rip currents triggered by wave action move at speeds exceeding 8 feet per second, which is faster than an Olympic swimmer's sprint pace, and they move offshore. The visual difference between the wave that soaks someone and the wave that kills them is essentially zero at the moment of contact. The outcome is determined entirely by physics variables happening below the surface that nobody on the shore can see. The camera caught everything. The Coast Guard report covered the section of the story that came after the footage ended. 11. Prank calls are as old as telephones, and the premise has always been the same. Fake voice, confused stranger, nobody gets hurt because it's just words, and words through a receiver are the safest possible delivery system for chaos. Swatting, which evolved directly and demonstrably from prank call culture, involves making a false emergency report to trigger an armed law enforcement response at a target's location. In 2017, a swatting call in Wichita, Kansas, resulted in the fatal police shooting of an uninvolved resident. The caller received a 20-year federal prison sentence. That is the full arc of the genre's evolutionary path, from fake pizza orders to a 20-year sentence and one dead person who had nothing to do with any of it. Prank calls to emergency services divert resources from genuine emergencies during the response window, and at least 2 documented cases exist where an ambulance was delayed in responding to a real cardiac event because the dispatch line was simultaneously processing a prank. The psychological harm from sustained targeted prank campaigns has been linked to documented cases of acute anxiety disorders and cited in at least one subsequent suicide. You called it a prank. The federal indictment used different vocabulary, and the vocabulary was more accurate. 12. Jumping into a stranger's photo, making a face, creating a memory that belongs to someone who didn't ask for you in it. It's participatory culture. It's spontaneous and joyful and essentially harmless because you're just adding to a moment rather than taking from it. Selfie-related death research tracked by multiple academic groups documented over 250 fatalities globally in a roughly decade-long window, with a significant subset involving unexpected contact or distraction at elevation. The startle response in a person standing at an unguarded edge can override motor control in under 100 milliseconds, which is faster than any conscious correction can engage. In crowded urban settings, the physical jostling required to position yourself for a photobomb has produced falls onto road surfaces and into traffic in documented cases that began as comedic street interactions with no hostile intent from anyone involved. The legal concept of negligent infliction of emotional distress has been successfully applied in cases where photobombing escalated into physical contact that caused a documented injury. The comedy defense has a genuinely poor record in those proceedings. You were going for a laugh. Physics and the law were both present at the same moment you made that decision, and neither of them found the framing as convincing as the crowd did. 13. The cascade. The slow-motion negotiation with gravity across a full flight of stairs. Objects flying in every direction, each step contributing its own distinct punctuation to the chaos. It's been making audiences cry-laugh since silent film, and the formula has never changed. Person goes down. Person gets up. Everyone cheers. Stair falls are the second leading cause of accidental injury death in the United States. They account for over 1 million emergency room visits and approximately 12,000 deaths every single year, which makes them significantly more lethal than your entire mental model of what a staircase is capable of. Each step in a full flight fall acts as a separate impact point, meaning the body absorbs multiple distinct traumatic events to different regions in under 2 seconds. Head injuries from stair falls produce rotational brain injury from the tumbling angular momentum, which is the same mechanism involved in some of the most severe pediatric brain injuries recognized by medicine, and it leaves no external evidence. The professional stunt performer who reproduced this fall for a film spent 3 days with a stunt coordinator, crash pads, body armor, and rehearsed controlled technique to make it survivable. Your version of this event came with gravity and the original flooring. Those were the only elements present. 14. The chair pulled away at the last second is 100 years old as a bit, and it has never once gotten less funny to the people watching. Someone goes to sit, chair disappears, they hit the floor, and the room erupts because the formula works every single time. The tailbone to floor impact from a chair pull generates compressive spinal force sufficient to fracture the coccyx, and in worst-case scenarios, cause sacral stress fractures, which are injuries that have no surgical treatment option. The medical response is pain management and rest for a minimum of several weeks, with a documented percentage of patients reporting chronic pain lasting years after the event. Multiple jurisdictions have pursued criminal assault charges against students who performed this exact prank, and the courts have consistently found that a century of comedic precedent does not constitute a legal defense once someone is sitting on a hospital examination table. The person falling from a seated height to a hard floor has no protective reflex engaged because the body has already allocated its postural resources to the chair it believes is still there. The person watching has all the information. The person falling has none of it. The joke is 100 years old. The spinal damage is brand new and entirely individual. 15. Petting zoo footage is peak innocent content. Baby animals, warm sunlight, children shrieking with delight, and occasionally someone's hat getting eaten. The Centers for Disease Control has documented dozens of multi-state E. coli and Cryptosporidium outbreaks directly linked to petting zoo contact, with children under 5 representing the highest risk group for the most severe systemic complications. The animal bite that gets laughed off as a nibble from an enthusiastic goat carries significant bacterial load. Caprine and ovine saliva contains organisms capable of causing serious wound infections in anyone whose immune system isn't operating at full capacity. The emu and ostrich attacks that generate some of the most popular outdoor event footage in existence involve birds capable of strike forces exceeding 300 pounds. These are the same animals that have disemboweled large predators in documented wildlife encounters. The detail that makes petting zoos specifically dangerous is the lag time. Zoonotic disease exposure produces no symptoms for 24 to 72 hours, meaning the family is home and has completely forgotten about the enthusiastic goat by the time anyone develops fever, cramping, or anything that signals a doctor visit is required. The goat ate your hat and issued a parting gift. The gift arrived on Thursday and required a laboratory confirmation. 16. The color run. The gender reveal. The festival powder throw. Someone gets blasted with a concentrated cloud of colorful powder, and it looks, objectively, like the inside of a dream sequence. The images are stunning. The moments are genuinely joyful. A 2019 gender reveal in California used a commercially sold smoke cannon filled with explosive powder. That device caused a wildfire that burned over 47,000 acres. Cornstarch and similar organic powders, which form the basis of most color run products, are classified as Class II explosive hazards when aerosolized at concentrations above 50 grams per cubic meter. A large crowd throw easily exceeds that threshold. Individuals with asthma or undiagnosed respiratory conditions can experience acute bronchospasm from high-concentration aerosolized irritant particles, and it happens fast enough that the event still looks like a celebration from the outside. Eye injuries from direct powder contact at color runs are well documented, with commercial color powder particle sizes sufficient to cause corneal abrasion requiring medical attention. You wanted a festive explosion. Physics, which does not distinguish between festive and structural, was happy to provide a literal one. The photos from the event look incredible. The 47,000 acres did not photograph as well from the same angle. 17. One insect enters the car cabin, and the driver immediately becomes a swerving, screaming pinball machine, and everyone agrees this is the most relatable thing that has ever happened to any human being operating a vehicle. It's universal. It's harmless. The bug is obviously winning. Driver distraction events as a category cause over 3,000 road deaths in the United States every single year, and a startle response to an unexpected insect in an enclosed space produces the same neurological cascade as a genuine threat, including brief loss of fine motor control, which is not a metaphor. A driver who is anaphylactically allergic to bee or wasp stings, which describes approximately 3% of the adult population, can experience onset of anaphylactic shock within 2 to 5 minutes of a sting while operating a vehicle at highway speed. The vehicle swerve pattern produced by in-cabin panic has the same accident fingerprint as distracted driving, and insurance investigators do not sort by cause of distraction when they're reconstructing what happened. At least a handful of documented fatal accidents have listed insect disturbance as a primary or contributing factor in official reports. The wasp survived the encounter completely intact and with no legal exposure. The outcomes for the other parties in the vehicle varied considerably, and not in the wasp's direction. 18. The most universal comedy category in existence is someone getting absolutely drenched by a wave they didn't see coming. The setup is identical every time. Person standing at the shoreline, looking the wrong way, enormous wall of water, spectacular obliteration. Except, this isn't about sneaker waves. This is about something even more ordinary. The rogue wave at the harbor, the boat wake at the dock, the fountain that activated at the wrong moment. The United States Geological Survey has documented coastal wave events that generated enough force to relocate boulders weighing several tons. Your body is not a boulder. Cold water shock from sudden immersion in water below 60 degrees Fahrenheit triggers an involuntary gasp reflex that initiates drowning before panic has had time to organize itself. The body doesn't wait for you to process the situation. It begins aspirating water while you're still in the part of the story where it's funny. Rip currents move at speeds exceeding 8 feet per second. An Olympic sprinter moves at roughly 30 feet per second on land, not in water, not in soaked clothing, not in shock. The camera caught the whole thing. The Coast Guard report started where the footage ended, and it used completely different language to describe the same event. 19, the chair pulled away at the last possible second, is 100 years old as a comedic device and has never once stopped working on an audience. The setup is elegant. Person approaches chair. Chair disappears. Person meets floor. Room erupts. The tailbone to floor impact from this specific mechanism generates compressive spinal force capable of fracturing the coccyx outright. There is no surgical fix for a coccyx fracture. The treatment is pain management and restricted movement for weeks, with a documented percentage of patients reporting chronic pain extending years beyond the initial event. Multiple jurisdictions have pursued criminal assault charges against individuals who performed this exact maneuver, and courts have consistently found that the joke's age and cultural familiarity do not constitute a legal defense once someone is sitting on a hospital examination table explaining how they got there. A person descending to sit has already committed their postural resources to a chair they believe exists. Every muscle is arranged around an assumption that is no longer true. They have zero reflex available for the floor. The watching crowd has all the information in the room. The falling person has none of it. The joke is 100 years old. The spinal damage it produces is brand new every single time. 20. Getting knocked into a pool fully clothed is a party staple so reliable that certain people build reputations around executing it. The splash is enormous. The expression is genuinely priceless. Drowning is the third leading cause of unintentional injury death globally, and a significant percentage of drowning incidents begin with exactly this mechanism: a sudden, unexpected water entry, not a failed swimming attempt. Cold water shock from abrupt full-body immersion can trigger cardiac arrest in individuals with undiagnosed coronary artery disease, a condition that is completely asymptomatic in a meaningful percentage of adults under 50 and has no visible prior warning. Waterlogged denim adds over 10 pounds of drag within seconds of submersion. If the person in the pool cannot swim, which describes nearly half the American adult population according to American Red Cross data, the clothing weight becomes a clinically significant factor within moments of entry. Secondary drowning, where aspirated water causes pulmonary edema hours after the event, has killed people who climbed out of the pool, appeared fine, and went to sleep. The crowd saw the splash and called it content. The pool applies the same physics to every single person who enters it unexpectedly, regardless of how funny the entry looked from the deck. 21. A loaded shopping cart making an unassisted run across a parking lot, picking up speed, and demolishing something expensive is the kind of footage that gets shared with pure, uncomplicated delight. It's the Rube Goldberg machine of everyday chaos. A loaded shopping cart weighs between 60 and 100 pounds and can reach speeds of 20 or more miles per hour on a moderate incline, which makes it a projectile with momentum, not a comedic prop with feelings. Pediatric parking lot injuries from runaway carts are documented extensively in emergency medicine literature. Children are struck at leg and torso height by metal cart frames, producing injuries including femur fractures and internal contusions that don't announce themselves on the outside. Elderly pedestrians struck by runaway carts have experienced hip fractures and fatal head injuries from the falls that follow the initial impact. The cart that clips an older person at the knee doesn't need to be moving fast. The fall does the rest. Vehicle damage from runaway carts is so statistically routine that several insurance categories specifically itemize it as a line item. The cart weighs as much as a large dog, moves faster than you think, and has no brakes, no awareness, and no interest in the pedestrian at the bottom of the slope. 22. The surprise party is one of the most loving ambushes in human social culture. Weeks of planning, perfect coordination, lights off, everyone crouching. And then the guest of honor walks in and the room explodes. Stress cardiomyopathy, also called Takotsubo syndrome, is directly triggered by sudden emotional shock. It is not exclusive to bad news. It has been documented following positive surprises in physiologically susceptible individuals whose hearts cannot distinguish between the emotional register of the shock and its intent. Your cardiac system does not understand the concept of a party. The startle reflex produces a cortisol and adrenaline surge that is neurologically identical regardless of whether the threat presenting itself is real or theatrical. In individuals with undetected cardiac arrhythmias, that surge is a documented cardiovascular stressor with documented outcomes. At least several documented cases exist of elderly individuals experiencing cardiac events at surprise parties. The combination of age, undetected arterial disease, and acute fright is a specific and recognized risk cluster. The scream and fall response that everyone treats as confirmation of a successful surprise is, clinically, a vasovagal episode, meaning the person briefly lost circulatory regulation. You planned the ambush for weeks. Their cardiovascular system had approximately 3 seconds to decide how it felt about the planning. 23. Watching someone try and fail to open an automatic door that hasn't registered them yet is one of modern life's most generous comedy offerings. The sensor doesn't trigger. The person walks with full confidence into the glass. The door wins. Collisions with glass doors and panels cause approximately 20,000 emergency room visits annually in the United States, including lacerations requiring surgery, orbital fractures, and in a small number of documented cases, fatal neck injuries resulting from full-speed glass contact. Non-safety glass panels are still present in a significant number of commercial buildings despite updated building codes, and they shatter into large laceration-producing fragments rather than the small pebbled pieces that safety glass produces. The orbital bones surrounding the eye socket are among the most fracture-prone bones in the human skull. A direct face-first impact with a glass surface at standard walking speed generates enough force to cause fractures that require surgical repair. Children running toward glass doors are particularly vulnerable because their height places the point of impact directly at head and neck level. Visually impaired and distracted individuals who make repeated contact with glass surfaces in public settings have generated premises liability claims. The comedy gap and the legal gap are structurally identical. The glass treated every version of the impact the same way. 24, the full tray, the catastrophic wobble, the cascade of dishes and beverages, and the dining room erupting. It's in every restaurant comedy ever filmed. It's been happening in real dining rooms for as long as restaurants have existed, and the waiter always recovers eventually, and everyone gets on with their meal. A commercial service tray bearing full plates and beverages weighs between 20 and 40 pounds. Its contents include liquids served at temperatures between 160 and 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Full thickness burns, the most severe classification, occur within 3 to 5 seconds of skin contact with liquid above 160 degrees. That is not a slow process. In 1994, Stella Liebeck sustained third-degree burns covering 6% of her body from a hot beverage spill, required skin grafting, and was hospitalized. That case became the cultural shorthand for frivolous litigation, but the medical record described a genuine and serious injury. Shattered ceramic and glassware produces fragments with laceration potential comparable to broken glass in any other context. Barefoot diners are particularly exposed. Secondary chaos from a large tray collapse in a crowded room, chairs pushed back suddenly, people startling, has produced trip and fall injuries to bystanders who were not within 10 feet of the original event. The audience was ready to applaud. The burn unit operates on a different schedule. 25, the monkey grabs the tourist's ice cream. The seagull executes a perfect dive bomb on the chips. The raccoon disappears into the night with something that was yours 30 seconds ago. It's wildlife content at its most generously entertaining, and everyone watching agrees the animal is simply correct and winning. The National Park Service policy that a fed bear is a dead bear exists because food-habituated bears that repeatedly approach humans must be destroyed. Hundreds of bears have been euthanized following human feeding incidents that began as interactions someone photographed and described as the highlight of the trip. Monkey bites sustained during food theft carry significant rabies and herpes B virus transmission risk. herpes B is carried asymptomatically by most macaque species. Its human mortality rate exceeds 70% without treatment, and treatment requires knowing you were exposed, which requires acknowledging the bite was more than a funny story. Seagull habituation to human food areas correlates directly with increasing aggression toward humans. Emergency departments in coastal UK towns have documented eye injuries from seagull strikes during food theft attempts. The raccoon got the granola bar. You got the story. The animal was euthanized 6 months later by wildlife management. That part has never once made the original post's comment section. 26. The rake handle ascending at speed toward the face of whoever just stepped on the tines is so thoroughly embedded in comedy culture that it became a recurring bit for a specific cartoon character across multiple decades. Everyone knows the image. Nobody thinks it's real because it's so perfectly mechanical it seems designed rather than accidental. Facial trauma from exactly this mechanism is documented in emergency medicine literature. The stepped-on rake generates a genuine lever arm of 4 to 5 feet from a tine depth of approximately 2 inches, producing impact velocity at face height that arrives faster than the human reflex response can engage. Nasal bone fractures are among the most common sports-adjacent facial injuries, and this mechanism is on the documented cause list. Occipital and orbital fractures from handle impacts exist in the case record for exactly this scenario. The sideshow Bob gag worked as comedy because it repeated. Each individual instance, in a real-world context, is sufficient to produce a skull fracture when the handle contacts the orbital region at full lever velocity. The stunt coordinator spent 3 days making the filmed version survivable, with padding and controlled angles. Your version of this event comes with the original rake, the original flooring, and exactly the face you walked in with. 27. Getting stuck in an elevator is one of the most reliable sitcom premises in the history of television. A small box, mismatched characters, escalating awkwardness, and eventually the doors open and everyone goes home with a story. Elevator cars are not sealed environments, but in hot weather, a stopped car with multiple occupants experiences significant interior temperature rise within 30 to 60 minutes. Documented cases of heat exhaustion in elevator entrapments exist, and they are not hypothetical edge cases. Individuals with panic disorder or claustrophobia experience full panic attacks within minutes of entrapment. The physiological cascade of a genuine panic attack includes chest pain and breathing difficulty that are clinically indistinguishable from cardiac events, which complicates both the self-assessment and the bystander assessment happening simultaneously in a very small room. The most dangerous moment in an elevator malfunction is not being stuck. It is the partial floor entrapment, where the car stops between floors and passengers attempt to climb out themselves. Documented deaths from falls into elevator shafts have occurred through exactly this mechanism, where the gap between the car floor and the building floor was misjudged by someone who decided waiting was the worst option. The sitcom version ends with the doors opening. The engineering incident report covers a different set of conclusions. 28. Children on escalators acting in ways that no adult would permit if they were paying attention is some of the most universally shared parenting content in existence. The refusal to step off, the backwards riding, the sitting down on moving stairs. The escalator comb plate gap, which is the serrated interface between the moving step and the stationary landing, generates sufficient mechanical force to partially amputate small fingers and toes in documented incidents. That process takes under 1 second, and it is irreversible from the moment it begins. Clothing entrapment in escalator mechanisms is a documented pediatric emergency. Soft shoes, particularly foam-soled varieties, and loose clothing have been drawn into the machinery at the comb point, producing injuries ranging from severe lacerations to degloving, which is a medical term for an injury category that deserves to be taken seriously every time it appears in a sentence. A child sitting on an escalator step has their face at the exact height of the handrail and comb plate. The supervising adult standing nearby is experiencing an entirely different geometry and cannot see the same hazard from their height. Consumer Product Safety Commission data shows escalator injuries to children spike sharply in shopping mall environments, which is precisely where the most distracted adults and the most excited children reliably intersect. 29. Throwing something at a performer has been audience participation since audiences and performers first occupied the same room, and in modern concert culture it has its own internal logic. The performer grins, the crowd interprets that as permission, and the whole ecosystem escalates. Bebe Rexha required medical attention for facial lacerations and a black eye in 2023 after being struck by a phone thrown from the crowd. A phone is not a soft object. At the velocity generated by an enthusiastic throw from crowd distance, its impact profile is comparable to a thrown rock, regardless of what the device's primary function is. The trajectory of objects thrown into a stage lighting rig creates a ricochet hazard that redirects the object unpredictably into the crowd at angles that no one planned and no one can anticipate. The thrower and their neighbors are simultaneously in the blast radius of whatever they just launched. Crowd projectile incidents have triggered panic events in which the subsequent crowd surge caused crush injuries. The thrown object was the first variable in a chain of events that produced outcomes the person who threw it did not intend and is not absolved from, because they didn't intend them. You expressed appreciation at high velocity. The performer's orbital socket received it and filed a report with different language. 30, the bucket of cold water, the setup, the betrayed expression, the absolute drenching. It has been a comedic device in every culture that has had both water and buckets, which is most of them, for most of recorded history. Cold shock response is the leading cause of death in sudden water immersion events. The involuntary gasp it triggers can cause water aspiration if the face is involved in the initial contact, and it does not require full submersion to begin. Ice water exposure below 59 degrees Fahrenheit applied to the torso and head causes a dramatic spike in blood pressure and heart rate simultaneously. In individuals with undetected hypertension or coronary artery disease, that simultaneous spike constitutes a genuine cardiac stress event with documented outcomes in the medical record. The ALS Ice Bucket Challenge generated enormous awareness and charitable funding, and also produced a documented drowning death involving a child at a challenge event, which received considerably less attention than the fundraising totals. Hypothermia onset time for a person standing outside in wet clothing in temperatures below 60 degrees is approximately 30 minutes. The prank ends when the laughter stops. The hypothermia clock does not consult the laughter before it decides when to start. It's just water. That classification does less work than you think it does. 31. Tail chasing is the kind of animal behavior that could not be more purely comedic if it were scripted. The absolute commitment, the spinning, the 0% chance of success, the dog fully aware that the tail is there and fully unwilling to accept any of the implications of that fact. Compulsive tail chasing in dogs is a documented symptom of canine obsessive compulsive disorder, neurological dysfunction, and in some cases a seizure disorder. Filming it and reinforcing it with laughter and attention accelerates the behavior's entrenchment, which is the opposite of helping. Bull terriers have a documented genetic predisposition to spinning behavior, a progressive neurological disorder that causes measurable distress to the animal and is not playfulness. Dogs that bite their own tails while chasing them cause themselves serious self-injury requiring veterinary treatment, including deep lacerations, partial degloving, and infections serious enough to require amputation of the tail. The behavior also presents as a response to a trapped nerve or spinal condition, meaning the dog is pursuing pain stimulus, not entertainment. Veterinary behaviorists classify compulsive tail chasing as a welfare concern. The animal is not in on the joke. You gave it 5 stars in the caption. The veterinarian 3 months later was working from a different assessment framework entirely. 32. The wind takes the hairpiece. The person goes still. The moment is exquisitely timed by meteorology and circumstance, and could not have been staged more effectively by anyone. The visual comedy is real, and it is immediate, and it lands every time, without fail. Alopecia areata affects approximately 2% of the global population. For many of those individuals, the hairpiece is not a vanity choice. It is a mental health accommodation for a condition that has no reliable treatment and that produces documented psychological distress at a clinical level. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy who experience hair loss in public settings report incidents of public mockery and exposure as among the most psychologically damaging aspects of an experience that is already doing significant damage. Severe burn survivors who use hair prosthetics have their hair loss tied directly to trauma. Having the prosthetic removed without consent in a public setting is legally actionable assault in multiple jurisdictions, regardless of whether wind was the mechanism or a person was. The filming and sharing of a stranger's involuntary physical exposure falls under increasingly robust privacy tort frameworks that do not have a wind exception. You got the laugh. You had no idea what was underneath it, what it cost, or what it meant to the person who was now standing there without it. 33. The food fight is the climactic set piece of every school movie ever made. The first roll, the escalation, the absolute collapse of institutional order into a mashed potato and chocolate milk free-for-all that somehow always ends with everyone laughing and nobody expelled. Anaphylaxis from airborne peanut protein in enclosed spaces has documented cases of severe allergic responses occurring in school cafeteria settings. A food fight is an uncontrolled aerosolization event in an enclosed room where the allergen content of the air is suddenly unknown. Food-covered hard floors produce slip conditions comparable to ice, and the combination of students running, projectile reflexive dodging, and furniture being pushed back has generated documented concussions and broken limbs in real school food fight incidents. Disciplinary and legal consequences have included suspension, expulsion, and in multiple United States school districts, criminal misdemeanor charges for property destruction. The movie ends before the paperwork. Custodial and health department costs associated with large-scale food contamination in public school cafeterias run into thousands of dollars per incident. Every surface in the room has been treated as a delivery vehicle for something that someone in that room might be severely allergic to. The camera cut to credits. The kid with the peanut allergy was still in the building when the credits rolled. 34. The fake death prank. The elaborate setup. The paralyzing reaction from the witness. The theatrical reveal. It is a genre with millions of views and a core premise that the reaction of genuine grief on someone else's face is entertainment you're entitled to manufacture. Inducing a sincere belief that a loved one has died triggers the same acute stress response as actual bereavement, because the brain and body do not have a mechanism for distinguishing theatrical loss from real loss in the moment of receipt. The catecholamine surge is identical. Individuals with undetected cardiac conditions have experienced cardiac events during fake death prank reveals. The disclosure that it was not real does not reverse the physiological cascade that has already been initiated. Several prominent prank creators in this category have faced criminal charges under distress and alarm statutes in jurisdictions where inducing genuine belief of a fatal event constitutes criminal harassment. Psychological aftermath documented in clinical case studies following fake death pranks on close relationship targets includes symptoms consistent with acute stress disorder. At least one documented case exists where a person who staged a fake drowning was subsequently not rescued by bystanders who assumed it was a performance and then drowned. The comedic frame of the setup prevented intervention. The reveal never came. 35. Watching someone get tased at what is billed as a comedy or entertainment event is a genre of spectacle that has existed long enough to feel normalized. Voluntary tastings at county fairs, bachelor parties, and online challenge formats. The convulsion, the drop, the recovery laugh. People pay to watch this. Some people volunteer. Taser deployment causes rhabdomyolysis, which is the breakdown of muscle tissue into the bloodstream in a documented percentage of applications. Between 2001 and 2018, over 1,000 people in the United States died following law enforcement taser deployment. The medical examiner debates about precise causation do not change what the correlation looks like across that dataset. Rhabdomyolysis from taser-induced muscle contraction can cause acute kidney failure, and it is invisible at the moment of application. It presents as a crisis 24 to 72 hours later, after the event is over and the video has already been uploaded. The fall itself is a separate problem. A taser overrides voluntary muscle control, which means the person drops with zero ability to brace, and documented head injuries from taser falls include fatal skull fractures in law enforcement contexts where the floor was the same floor you're standing on. He signed the waiver. His potassium levels did not receive a copy. 36. Two guys squaring up in a bar. One wild swing. Someone going into a table. Phones out. Crowd stepping back to give the scene room to develop. It's chaotic theater. It looks like movies because movies borrowed it from exactly this. Bar fights are a leading cause of traumatic brain injury in adults under 40, and the most lethal mechanism is not the punch. It is the fall that follows the punch. The one-punch death, where a single strike causes a fall producing a fatal occipital skull fracture or subdural hematoma, has been documented in hundreds of cases globally. Australia passed specific legislation criminalizing it as manslaughter because the pattern was that consistent. A person who is knocked unconscious has lost all protective muscle tone and falls at full dead weight velocity with their head as the leading point of contact with whatever surface is below them. Glass weapons in bar fight contexts produce laceration injuries significantly more severe than blunt trauma. Femoral artery lacerations from broken glass have caused deaths that began as shoving matches. Bystander filming of bar fights has produced criminal liability in jurisdictions that prosecute failure to assist when the bystander was within safe intervention distance. The phone was the choice. The skull doesn't sort by reason. 37. Scaring someone mid-task is the elevated form of the genre. Not just a surprise, but a surprise engineered to have consequences built into the setup. Someone on a ladder. Someone using a power tool. Someone carrying something that requires both hands and full attention. The startle reflex produces a full-body involuntary response that overrides conscious motor control for approximately 500 milliseconds. On a ladder, 500 milliseconds of uncontrolled movement is sufficient to produce a fatal fall. Occupational safety research documents that unexpected auditory or physical stimuli are a contributing factor in tool-related injuries, and OSHA's general duty clause has been applied in cases where deliberate workplace horseplay contributed to a documented injury. Power tool injuries induced by startle include table saw lacerations, drill injuries, and in one case, a nail gun discharge that caused penetrating cranial injury. Each of those incidents began as a prank that someone thought would be funny, precisely because of the stakes involved. Civil courts in multiple jurisdictions have awarded significant damages to plaintiffs injured by deliberate startle pranks. The defense of not thinking it would do that has a documented and consistent record of not working once the injury exists and has been photographed. The laughing lasted 4 seconds. The civil litigation ran 4 years. 38. The mannequin challenge was a collective performance art moment. Offices, schools, sports teams, entire airplane cabins freezing in place while a camera moved through them. Creative, strange, weirdly impressive, and from the outside, completely harmless, because everyone is just standing still. Mannequin challenge videos filmed at active construction sites showed workers frozen in positions adjacent to unsecured loads, open excavations, and operating equipment. OSHA reviewed several of those videos and issued safety citations based on what was visible in the frame. The social pressure dynamic of viral challenges causes participants to override personal safety judgment, and this mechanism was explicitly cited by health authorities during each subsequent fatal social media challenge trend. The blackout challenge, which evolved through the same viral participation culture, has been causally linked to the deaths of multiple children. Platform liability for viral challenges has been tested in multiple courts, with TikTok, Meta, and YouTube facing claims related to the algorithmic amplification of demonstrably dangerous challenge content to minors. The fun moment and the incident report describe the same sequence of events using completely incompatible frameworks, and only one of those frameworks has legal standing in a courtroom. The views on the construction site video were excellent. OSHA's documentation of what was visible in those same frames was equally thorough. 39. An untrained person attempting a professional-level physical stunt in a social setting is one of the most reliable content formats available. The backflip at the wedding. The skateboard trick from the dad who used to skate. The gymnastics vault attempt by someone who watched enough Olympics to feel prepared. Cervical spine fractures, which produce outcomes ranging from permanent paralysis to death, disproportionately occur in exactly this context. An untrained individual attempting a skill that requires progressive physical conditioning their body has never developed. Trampolinist's neck is an actual documented injury pattern, specifically cervical compression fractures from failed flips, and it occurs predominantly in recreational settings rather than competitive ones because recreational settings have none of the safety infrastructure. Skateboarding head injuries send approximately 26,000 Americans to emergency rooms annually, with a disproportionate cluster of severe injuries among adult beginners attempting skills observed online. The backflip failure mechanism is particularly specific. A partial rotation that lands the person on the top or back of the head produces a spinal loading event that trained gymnasts are conditioned over years to avoid. Several documented wedding and party stunt attempts that resulted in spinal injury have produced high-value lawsuits against venues for failing to discourage the activity. The room was ready to laugh. The spinal cord was not ready for any part of what followed. 40, pointing a laser pointer at something from across a room, a parking lot, a venue, and watching the confusion it generates. It fits in your pocket. It's a dot of light. It's been sold as a presentation tool and a cat toy, and it is clearly one of the most harmless objects that exists in a consumer context. The FAA recorded over 9,700 laser strikes on aircraft in the United States in 2021 alone. A Class 3 or Class 4 laser at cockpit distance, both of which are commercially available and frequently mislabeled in terms of actual power output, can cause flash blindness lasting several minutes during a landing approach. Retinal burns from direct laser exposure are permanent. The photoreceptors destroyed do not regenerate. Documented cases of permanent vision loss from consumer laser pointers exist in both children and adults who experienced brief, direct exposure. Federal penalties for laser strikes on aircraft begin at $11,000 per violation and include felony prosecution. Multiple individuals have received prison sentences for events they described at the time as messing around. Green laser pointers, marketed as toys and astronomy aids, exceed safe exposure limits by a factor of 10 or more in cheap manufacturing due to inadequate infrared filtration. You pointed a dot of light at a plane. The pilot's retina has no sense of humor about the distinction. 41. The Canada goose is the internet's favorite outdoor nemesis. The hissing, the neck extended to its full and alarming length, the absolute commitment to the chase, the complete refusal to acknowledge that you are significantly larger. It is unhinged, it is absurd, and the footwork required to evade one is genuinely comedic. Canada geese have a wingspan of up to 6 feet and a wing strike force capable of causing significant blunt trauma. Documented arm fractures from goose-wing strikes exist in both veterinary and emergency medicine literature, not as theoretical concerns, but as actual injuries requiring actual treatment. The primary injury mechanism, however, is not the goose. It is the person fleeing it. Running in genuine panic on wet grass near water on uneven terrain has produced falls resulting in fractures and concussions in documented goose chase incidents. Elderly individuals chased or struck by geese in public park settings have experienced outcomes requiring emergency medical treatment, and the math changes significantly when the target is 75 years old and running on a wet path next to a pond. Multiple corporate campuses and public parks have generated workers' compensation claims directly attributed to aggressive geese on the premises. 10 pounds of bird, a wet path, a 70-year-old hip. The arithmetic reached a dark conclusion before the goose was anywhere near the person. 42. The hiccup cure tournament is a fixture of social gatherings. Someone gets hiccups. Everyone immediately becomes a competing expert with a different method, and the whole enterprise is gently ridiculous and completely harmless because it's just hiccups. Chronic intractable hiccups lasting more than 48 hours are classified medically as persistent and are a documented indication for diagnostic investigation. They can be symptoms of stroke, brain tumor, esophageal cancer, or serious neurological events. And the comedy framework surrounding common hiccups normalizes the symptom in a way that delays the recognition of when it has crossed into something that requires attention. The world record for sustained hiccuping is 68 years, which belongs to Charles Osborne, who hiccuped from 1922 to 1990, and while extreme, illustrates the neurological intractability of the condition when genuine pathology is involved. Violent scare cures for hiccups have produced vasovagal syncope in documented cases among individuals with elevated susceptibility, meaning the cure attempt caused a faint. Hiccups lasting more than 48 hours in an elderly individual or someone with cardiac history are specifically contraindicated for scare-based interventions. You ran the cure competition for 25 minutes. The thing you were treating as a punchline had qualified for a neurology referral approximately 47 hours ago. 43. The passenger pretending to fall asleep mid-drive is a road trip classic. The slump, the fake snore, the driver glancing over, the panic response, and then the reveal. Everyone, including the driver, ends up laughing. At 65 miles per hour, a driver who pulls their eyes from the road for 3 to 4 seconds travels 285 feet of road with zero input. The startle response produced by unexpected passenger behavior generates the same physiological cascade as a genuine threat, including brief involuntary loss of fine motor control, which is not a theoretical concern, but a documented contributor to lane deviation events. Startle responses in drivers produce involuntary steering inputs, including swerving into adjacent lanes, and at highway speed, that input is transmitted to a 2-ton vehicle before the conscious mind has had time to process what happened. Several jurisdictions have successfully prosecuted passengers whose deliberate in-vehicle pranks caused accidents under reckless endangerment statutes, and the courts have consistently found that comedic intent does not retroactively reassign physical causation. Fatigue-related accidents cause over 6,000 deaths annually in the United States. A driver who genuinely believes their passenger has suddenly lost consciousness is experiencing an acute physiological stressor with measurable effects on vehicle control. You were going for laughs. The 285 feet did not care about the setup. 44. The kitchen blowtorch moment where someone gets slightly too enthusiastic with the creme brulee and something adjacent catches. The smoke alarm. The scramble. The singed item. The story that gets told at every dinner party for the next 3 years. Cooking fires are the leading cause of residential structure fires in the United States. Flash fires from kitchen blowtorches igniting nearby flammable materials, specifically paper towels, dishcloths, and curtains, escalate to room involvement within 30 seconds. The window between a funny close call and a structure fire is genuinely that narrow and does not announce which version it is during the first 15 seconds. Eyebrow and eyelash burns, the most common blowtorch comedy injury, are frequently accompanied by corneal flash burns that are invisible at the time of the event and present as severe eye pain 6 to 12 hours later, well after everyone has agreed it was hilarious. If the scalp is involved, hair fires spread to face and neck before the pain receptors have finished sending the first signal. The NFPA reports that home cooking fires cause approximately 550 deaths, 4,900 injuries, and $1.1 billion in property damage annually in the United States. The eyebrows grew back. The insurance adjuster found zero humor in the blowtorch explanation and used a different vocabulary for the same event. 45. Teenage dare culture is so foundational to adolescent social life that it barely registers as a risk category from the inside. Someone has to prove something. Someone has to accept a dare they know is bad, because the social cost of declining exceeds, in that moment, the physical cost of complying. The psychological mechanism of dare acceptance is driven by loss aversion, specifically fear of social exclusion, rather than genuine risk assessment, and adolescent brains are neurologically less capable of accurate risk evaluation due to incomplete prefrontal cortex development that continues until approximately age 25. The fire challenge, a dare involving applying accelerant to skin and igniting it, resulted in documented cases of severe burns requiring skin grafting in teenagers who accepted the dare via social media. Roof and elevated structure dares are a leading cause of traumatic brain injury and spinal injury in 13 to 18-year-olds. The escalation dynamic of in-group dare culture means each completed dare sets a new baseline for what counts as an acceptable threshold, and the progression from embarrassing to genuinely dangerous follows a documented pattern in adolescent risk behavior research. The social pressure that made the dare feel mandatory has never once showed up in the emergency room to explain itself. Everyone was laughing right up until the dare became the incident report. 46. Competitive eating is a spectator sport, a televised event, a sponsored competition with professional participants, and from the crowd's perspective, an exercise in pure absurdist entertainment. Hot dogs, chicken wings, pie, the competitors in matching shirts, demolishing volumes of food that do not correspond to any natural biological capacity, while a crowd cheers. Gastric rupture, where the stomach wall tears from overpressure, is a documented risk in competitive eating. It is a surgical emergency with no gradual warning phase, and it has occurred in competitive contexts. Aspiration pneumonia from inhaling food particles during speed eating has been documented in the sport's medical literature, and the combination of rapid swallowing, reduced chewing, and extreme volume creates precisely the conditions that maximize aspiration risk. Research published in the American Journal of Röntgenology documented that competitive eaters develop significantly expanded, hypocontractile stomachs that impair normal satiety function on a long-term basis. Amateur events, local hot dog contests, informal competitions where untrained participants attempt what professionals execute with years of technique have produced choking deaths. The professional manages the volume through developed technique. The person next to you at the county fair has enthusiasm and no technique at all. The trophy was 12 inches tall. The medical infrastructure required to manage what the sport does to the body is considerably larger and considerably less fun to look at. 47. The drunk uncle wedding speech is practically its own cultural institution. The rambling, the forgotten names, the escalating confidence, the face of the couple in the foreground trying to decide what expression to hold. It is genuinely one of the finest forms of live unscripted theater available at no additional charge. Blood alcohol content of 0.25, which is associated with the behavioral profile that makes this category of speech so entertaining, is within the clinical range where aspiration of vomit during sleep becomes a statistically significant cause of death. That is not a dramatic warning. That is a documented mechanism. Wedding venues are a documented convergence point for open bar consumption, emotional elevation, and subsequent vehicle operation, and drunk driving fatalities spike measurably around major celebration events. The social context of a wedding creates a permission structure where blood alcohol levels that would generate genuine alarm in isolation are celebrated and documented in photographs. Alcohol-related falls at wedding receptions, from elevated dance floors, stairs, and the specific combination of formal footwear and alcohol, are a specific category in event venue liability insurance literature. The speech was a 10. Genuinely. Everyone agreed. The drive home was where the evening stopped being a comedy and became a statistic, and nobody from the reception was there to see which version it became. 48. Failed magic tricks are endearing in a specific way that successful magic tricks are not, because the failure reveals the human inside the spectacle, and everyone in the room suddenly feels affectionately superior. The card goes the wrong direction. The volunteer sees the rabbit. The handkerchief collapses. Stage illusion failures in professional contexts, as distinct from card trick errors, have caused documented serious injuries and deaths. Harry Houdini's death is the most famous production-adjacent fatality, but professional magic injury databases document ongoing incidents, including failed water tank escape acts, sawing illusions, and suspension tricks that did not release as engineered. Fire-based stage illusions have a documented malfunction rate. Misfired pyrotechnics at live performances have caused audience member burns, and in several cases ignited venue structures. Straitjacket and restraint-based escape acts that malfunction create a genuine entrapment emergency where the performer is physically bound and cannot self-rescue, and the response time between recognition and extraction is the entire margin between a story and a fatality. Audience participation tricks have produced injuries from improperly secured props, and in one well-documented case, a participant injured when a fail-safe mechanism triggered without warning. The trick was supposed to fail safely. That phrase contains an assumption that is doing an enormous amount of structural work in a sentence about a restraint device. 49. A child drawing on the walls is a rite of passage so universally experienced that it has its own cultural shorthand. The tiny hand, the elaborate mural at knee height, the mix of genuine exasperation and the secret recognition that it is actually kind of impressive. The United States Poison Control System receives over 2 million calls annually, and the majority involve children under 5 who accessed household chemicals, medications, or toxic plants during exactly the kind of unsupervised exploratory behavior that produced the wall art in the first place. The laugh response to one context creates a habituation that delays the alarm response in the adjacent context, and the adjacent context is the unlocked cabinet at the same height as the crayons. Button battery ingestion, which can cause fatal internal burns within 2 hours through direct electrical current to esophageal tissue, disproportionately occurs in the same exploratory age range and behavioral profile as the category you called adorable mischief. Pediatric safety researchers have specifically noted the irony that the most widely shared comedy content involving young children is frequently generated by the most dangerous, unsupervised scenarios. The wall was fine. The crayon caused no lasting damage to anything except the paint. The unlocked cabinet 2 feet to the left of it was a completely different conversation that nobody had yet because nobody thought to have it. 50. The neighbor's dog that is all bark and absolutely no bite according to the owner, who is laughing, while the dog is doing something that reads differently to anyone who is not the owner. Dog bites send approximately 800,000 Americans to the emergency room annually, which makes them one of the most common animal-related medical events in the country by a significant margin. The phrase "he's friendly" is the documented verbal context in the majority of serious dog bite cases reviewed in emergency medicine literature, and the gap between the owner's assessment and the dog's behavioral state is not a fluke. It is the consistent finding. Dog bite force across medium and large breeds averages 150 to 200 pounds per square inch, which is sufficient to cause compound fractures in the hand and arm bones that people instinctively extend toward dogs. Children are bitten disproportionately in the face and neck because that is where their bodies are positioned relative to the dog's head. Facial dog bites account for the majority of reconstructive surgery cases following animal attacks. Canine body language indicating stress and imminent aggression is not recognized by the majority of adults present. The owner said friendly. The emergency room coded it differently. The dog was entirely consistent throughout the entire event. Only the humans were operating on different information. 51. Laughing so hard you can't breathe is the most enthusiastic possible compliment you can pay to a piece of comedy, and everyone who has said it has also been completely wrong about the physics of what they were claiming. Galactic syncope, which is fainting triggered by intense laughter, is a documented medical phenomenon. It is not a metaphor. It occurs when intense laughter triggers a vasovagal response that drops blood pressure and cerebral perfusion below the threshold required to maintain consciousness, and it is clinically indistinguishable from other forms of syncope at the moment it happens. A spontaneous pneumothorax triggered by a severe laughing episode was documented in a 1989 case study in the British Medical Journal. The pressure changes in the chest cavity during sustained forced exhalation are sufficient to rupture a pre-existing bleb on the lung surface. The death of the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus around 207 BC is historically attributed to fatal laughter. The historical record of laughter-induced death is therefore longer than most people's working assumption about what laughter is capable of. Individuals with long QT syndrome, which affects an estimated 1 in 2,000 people and is frequently undetected, can experience ventricular fibrillation triggered by sudden emotional arousal, including intense laughter. You said you were dying? Your cardiovascular system briefly looked at the memo and considered whether to take it literally. 52. Swallowing gum stays in your stomach for 7 years is the kind of parental doctrine delivered with such absolute authority that most people carry it into adulthood without ever examining it. The gum base, which includes resins, elastomers, and waxes, is indigestible but not immovable. Peristalsis carries it through the digestive tract and out of the body within a few days to a week, exactly as it handles other indigestible matter. The 7-year figure is medically false. What is not false is the 1998 case report in the journal Pediatrics documenting 3 children who developed bezoars, which are masses of accumulated indigestible material from habitual gum swallowing. One of those children required surgical removal of the obstruction. The myth's persistence creates a specific and measurable problem. Parents who believe the 7-year story panic unnecessarily when a child swallows a single piece, and simultaneously fail to recognize the genuine risk pattern, which is habitual multiple-piece swallowing over extended periods, as a concern worth addressing. The myth is wrong in the direction that makes it useless as a safety tool, while remaining fully intact as a source of childhood anxiety. The 7 years was fiction. The surgery from swallowing 30 pieces across a week was a real procedure performed on a real child. 53. A swarm of bees giving chase is comedy gold in the flailing arms high knees genre, and the resolution is always the same. You outrun them. Maybe someone falls in a pond. Maximum entertainment for everyone who was not personally involved. Africanized honeybees, which are behaviorally indistinguishable from European honeybees to an untrained observer, can pursue a target for distances up to a quarter mile and maintain an agitated defensive state for 24 hours after a hive disturbance. The run and you'll be fine strategy fails completely against this species because it was designed around a different bee. Anaphylaxis from bee stings kills approximately 60 to 70 Americans annually, and the critical variable is not the number of stings, but the individual immune response. A single sting from any bee species can be fatal in a sensitized individual. Mass envenomation from multiple stings causes a toxic reaction even in non-anaphylactic individuals, and approximately 500 stings constitutes a lethal dose for an average adult. Africanized swarms can deliver that quantity within minutes of engagement. The geographical range of Africanized honeybees now covers most of the southern tier of the United States. The comedy version of the bee chase was written for a different bee. The bee on your left was not reading from the same script. 54. Someone starts choking at the dinner table, coughs explosively, goes red, makes everyone freeze for 15 seconds, and then waves off the concern, and everyone exhales, and someone makes a joke, and the meal continues. The body fixed it. It always fixes it. A partial airway obstruction that allows some air movement can become a complete obstruction if the object shifts position, particularly when the person relaxes following the initial coughing effort, because muscle tension decreases and the object settles differently. The universal choking sign, hands to throat, is recognized by fewer than 50% of bystanders in documented emergency response studies. The majority default to backslapping, which is contraindicated for a conscious choking victim under several major clinical guidelines. Café coronary is a medical term coined specifically because victims of sudden choking deaths were so frequently misidentified as cardiac events that the pattern needed its own name. People collapse without warning after appearing to manage the obstruction, and the room around them had no idea the status had changed. The Heimlich maneuver performed incorrectly causes documented rib fractures and organ lacerations. The intervention carries injury risk. The alternative is a 100% fatal airway obstruction. The coughing looked like it was working right up until it stopped, and the stop had no warning attached to it. 55 novelty crowd impact items at concerts and sporting events are handed out by the thousands and used immediately and enthusiastically by people who have been waiting for an excuse to hit something. Foam bats, inflatable hammers, thunder sticks, oversized props in every configuration. Inflatable thunder sticks, the clapping tubes distributed at sporting events, generate peak sound pressure levels exceeding 100 decibels when struck together near the ear. Repeated exposure at that level produces measurable temporary threshold shift in hearing, which is the clinical precursor to permanent hearing loss, and the fact that it happens inside an already loud venue does not reduce the cumulative damage. Rigid novelty foam products swung at head height by excited or intoxicated crowd members have caused corneal injuries, nasal fractures, and concussions in adjacent spectators who had no involvement in the decision to swing the item. Large crowd-surfed inflatable items have triggered crowd surges when they move against crowd flow, and at least 2 documented crowd compression events have been partially attributed to large inflatable object movement through dense crowds. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has issued recalls on specific novelty items distributed at public events due to hazardous material content including lead paint and toxic off-gassing. It was foam and air, packaged at a sound pressure level your cochlea is still processing a formal objection about. 56. Crowd surfing is the communion ritual of certain live music experiences. You go horizontal. The crowd receives you. You move toward the stage on a wave of strangers, and for a brief moment, everyone in the room is participating in something collectively. The drop rate for crowd surfers is not negligible. Spinal injuries from crowd surf drops, where the crowd fails to maintain support and the surfer falls from head height to the floor, have resulted in permanent paralysis in documented cases. Sexual assault during crowd surfing is documented extensively and not peripherally. The Woodstock 99 reporting detailed systematic assault of crowd surfers, and major festivals have added crowd surfing prohibitions specifically in response to that documentation and the broader pattern it represented. Security personnel at major venues report that crowd surfer removal creates a local surge and counter-surge that compresses the crowd at the extraction point, which is a crowd dynamics effect that contributes directly to crush risk for the people standing in that area. Head and neck injuries from being dropped or from contact with crowd members during the surf have required emergency spinal precaution responses at music festivals. The crowd caught you enthusiastically on the way up. The floor was significantly less enthusiastic about its role in the second half of the interaction. 57. Unintentional firearm deaths are the leading cause of death for children and adolescents in the United States as of 2020 data, surpassing motor vehicle accidents, and the majority involve firearms that the adult in the home believed were safely stored or unloaded at the time of the incident. The "it wasn't loaded" assumption is factually incorrect in a significant percentage of cases, because magazine-fed firearms retain a round in the chamber independently of the magazine, and this is a mechanical reality that is not intuitive to someone who has not been specifically trained on it. Children as young as 3 years old have sufficient hand strength to operate standard firearm triggers. Child-resistant trigger locks exist and are present in fewer than 25% of homes with both children and firearms according to survey data. The Eddie Eagle Gun Safety Program teaches children to stop, don't touch, and leave the area. But research indicates that children who have been given those instructions will still handle the firearm when unsupervised within hours of receiving them. Loaded firearms stored in vehicles are the source of a disproportionate number of child firearm deaths and injuries. The story ended okay that time. The statistics are a comprehensive account of what happened all the other times, and there were a significant number of other times. 58. Mobile carnival ride malfunctions are a documented source of serious injury and fatalities, and the regulatory gap between permanent amusement parks and traveling carnivals leaves mobile rides operating under significantly less oversight than the rides at the park you drove past on the highway. The Consumer Product Safety Commission estimates approximately 30,000 amusement ride-related injuries annually, with traveling rides carrying a disproportionate injury rate compared to permanent installations. Regulatory oversight of traveling carnival rides varies dramatically by state, and some states have no mandatory inspection requirements for mobile rides at all, which means a ride that failed inspection in one jurisdiction can legally set up and operate in the next one. Ejection events, where riders are thrown from rides during malfunction, have caused fatalities at fairs and traveling carnivals. Restraint system failures in mobile rides are more common than in permanently installed and regularly inspected park rides. Ride operator training for traveling carnivals is largely unregulated, and documented fatal malfunctions have been attributed to operator error, including incorrect restraint checks and improper ride loading procedures. The ride had been set up and broken down in 4 different states over the previous 3 weeks. None of those states had checked the restraints using the same standard. You sat down and assumed someone had verified the math. 59. The hot sauce challenge is the culinary theater version of proving something about yourself, and the table around you is the audience. Someone's crying. Someone's sweating. The rest of the group is losing it. Temporary discomfort. The spice wears off. A 2018 case report in BMJ Case Reports documented a patient who developed reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome following consumption of a Carolina Reaper pepper. Reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome causes intense thunderclap headaches from cerebral artery spasm and carries a risk of stroke. That is the documented outcome of eating a single pepper in a challenge context. Esophageal spasm triggered by extreme capsaicin produces chest pain and difficulty swallowing that is clinically indistinguishable from myocardial infarction, and multiple documented emergency room visits from hot sauce challenge participants have required full cardiac workups before the actual cause was identified and the patient was cleared. Capsaicin at extreme concentrations causes chemical burns to mucous membranes. Aspiration of extremely hot sauce in rapid consumption challenge formats carries a pneumonitis risk because capsaicin aspiration causes significant airway inflammation. The wing was funny to watch someone eat from across the table. The neurological event that followed was considerably less telegenic and considerably more expensive to treat than the wing cost to purchase. 60. Household static electricity gets a universal pass because everyone has experienced the doorknob shock and walked away from it with nothing more than a startled noise and a brief recalibration of their opinion of winter. Static discharge is the ignition source in a documented category of fuel station fires. The mechanism involves a person exiting their vehicle, building a static charge on their clothing, and then reaching for the fuel nozzle. The National Fire Protection Association has issued specific guidance on this hazard because the incidents are not theoretical. In industrial environments handling flammable vapors or combustible dust, a static discharge of as little as 0.1 millijoule is sufficient to trigger ignition. Grain elevator explosions, which have killed dozens of workers, are frequently initiated by static discharge in exactly this way. Individuals with older pacemaker models have been specifically cautioned about high static environments because significant discharge near the device can trigger inappropriate pacing. The physics of the doorknob shock and the physics of the grain elevator explosion are identical. The context determines whether the outcome is a startled noise or a fire investigation. Same spark. Same mechanism. One of those contexts has a dedicated federal investigation unit, and the other one you complained about on social media in December. The distinction between them is entirely environmental. 61. Eyeball tattooing is the commitment to aesthetic self-expression that exists so far past any reasonable threshold that it functions as its own argument. Scleral tattooing involves injecting ink directly under the conjunctiva of the eye. Documented complications include severe infection, retinal detachment, chronic pain requiring enucleation, which is the surgical removal of the eye, and total permanent vision loss. A Canadian model lost sight in one eye following the procedure in 2017 and has documented the experience publicly and at length. The procedure is performed without anesthetic in non-medical settings, has no regulatory oversight in most jurisdictions, and has no established safe technique because no clinical evidence base for a safe technique exists. Standard tattoo ink injected into the sclera does not remain in the intended location. It migrates, causing ongoing inflammation and progressive damage to structures it was never intended to contact, and the damage is not reversible once it begins. Face and neck tattoos have documented occupational discrimination consequences, with studies showing significantly reduced employment interview callback rates in controlled experiments. The eyeball tattoo sits at the extreme end of a category, with a multi-decade financial and medical footnote attached to it. The commitment to the bit was the boldest you will ever make. It was also the last thing that I saw clearly, and that timeline started the same afternoon. 62. Scaring someone who is deeply focused or in a meditative state is the refined version of the genre. Not just a surprise, but a surprise deployed on a target who has specifically removed themselves from awareness of the surrounding environment and is therefore maximally unprepared. The Moro reflex, the full body startle response, produces simultaneous extension and flexion of the limbs with a brief loss of postural control. In a person seated at a desk, this produces a head strike trajectory toward the nearest hard surface. Individuals with PTSD experience a hyper-exaggerated startle response as a diagnostic criterion of the condition. It is not a funny reaction. It is a clinical symptom being triggered by your decision to stand behind someone and make a loud noise. Pranking a person with PTSD produces a documented clinical event, and the fact that you did not know they had PTSD does not alter what happened to their nervous system. The physiological cascade of a genuine startle includes cortisol and adrenaline release that constitutes a cardiovascular stressor in individuals with hypertension or cardiac conditions. Video evidence from scare prank channels has been used in multiple civil lawsuits as direct evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress and assault. You got the reaction you planned. The reaction was also a diagnosis, and you are now Exhibit A in the supporting documentation. 63. The gallon milk challenge has a completely predictable outcome, and that is the entire premise. You cannot do it. Everyone knows you cannot do it. Someone tries anyway, suffers on schedule, and the group collects their entertainment from the reliable biological process that follows. The human stomach holds approximately 1 liter at comfortable capacity. Forcing 3.78 liters of liquid into it overwhelms gastric capacity, and lactase insufficiency, which is present in approximately 65% of adults globally, accelerates the distress through gas production and osmotic diarrhea simultaneously. Aspiration pneumonitis from inhaling vomit is a documented medical emergency requiring hospitalization. The DARE format, which encourages the participant to suppress the vomiting reflex for as long as possible to demonstrate commitment, is the specific mechanism that increases aspiration risk by creating delay between the onset of nausea and the expulsion that would reduce the threat. Mallory-Weiss tears are longitudinal lacerations of the esophageal mucosa caused by forceful, repeated vomiting. They present as bloody vomit and require endoscopic evaluation. The DARE applies social pressure that causes participants to continue past the point of acute gastric distress, significantly increasing the volume available for aspiration during the inevitable outcome. The DARE lasted 4 minutes. The Mallory-Weiss tear had a recovery timeline measured in weeks rather than minutes. 64. The large dog locked onto you from across the yard, fully committed, launching across the distance at maximum speed with every intention of expressing enthusiasm directly into your sternum. It is the most wholesome impact event in domestic life, and it might knock you flat, and that part is also funny. A 60-pound dog running at 15 miles per hour and making contact with a standing human generates approximately 270 pounds of force at the point of impact. That is enough to produce a backward fall in an adult who is not braced for the contact. Wrist fractures from falling backward after a dog impact follow the same mechanism as any backward fall. The hands extend reflexively to break the fall, and the radius bone absorbs the full force of a bodyweight impact against a hard floor. Elderly individuals knocked down by enthusiastic large dogs have sustained hip fractures, head injuries, and in documented cases have not survived the medical cascade that followed the fall. Several wrongful death lawsuits against dog owners have been filed on exactly this basis. Children struck by running large dogs experience a different impact geometry because the dog's body contacts them at center of mass, producing a more total fall. Pure love. 270 pounds of it, delivered at 15 miles per hour directly to the sternum of someone who was not ready. 65. Treadmill falls are their own content genre. The confident start, the velocity mismatch, the spectacular exit, and the person peeling themselves off the floor, looking like they have reconsidered several life decisions simultaneously. Treadmill-related injuries send approximately 24,000 Americans to emergency rooms every single year. The most severe injury category is not the dramatic exit. It is the traumatic brain injury, which follows when the ejected person contacts the wall or equipment behind the treadmill after being launched at the belt's operating speed. A fall from a treadmill running at 10 miles per hour produces impact physics equivalent to a fall from approximately 6 feet while moving laterally, which is not how anyone describes a treadmill fall when they are explaining why the video was funny. Treadmill friction burns are classified as abrasions, but function as burns. Deep, painful, prone to infection, and in cases involving significant skin surface area, requiring the same treatment protocols as thermal burns. The 2021 Peloton tread recall was triggered by the death of a child, and dozens of documented injuries involving children and pets being pulled under the rear roller of the machine. The video cut off before the skin graft consultation. The algorithm, in that one specific instance, and possibly for the first time, showed something that functions approximately like mercy. 66. Retail crowd surges are the consumer version of a phenomenon that everyone recognizes from concert and stadium contexts, and nobody applies the same risk framework to because it is happening in a store. Jedimitai Damour, a 34-year-old Walmart temporary employee, was killed on November 28, 2008, when a crowd of approximately 2,000 shoppers broke down the entrance and trampled him. The crowd had been accumulating since the night before, and had reached compression densities that made individual movement impossible for anyone inside it. Crowd crush physics operate by the same mechanism regardless of whether the crowd is gathered for music or merchandise. At densities exceeding approximately 4 people per square meter, individuals lose the ability to control their own movement and become subject to compressive asphyxia from the pressure of the crowd itself. Multiple documented injuries at retail rush events include broken bones, lacerations, and panic-induced cardiac events among elderly shoppers caught in surging crowds. OSHA cited Walmart following the 2008 death, establishing that employers have a legal duty to protect workers from foreseeable crowd hazards. The legal framework for the comedy of shopping chaos was built directly around what happened when someone treated it as inconsequential. The deal was 70% off. The employee at the entrance did not survive to see what was on sale. 67 world record attempts for physically dangerous categories require medical personnel on site, trained spotters, and documented safety protocols under official Guinness guidelines. The viral social media version of a world record attempt replicates the concept and removes every single one of those requirements because the concept is the entertaining part and the infrastructure is not. Prolonged physical endurance record attempts, including extended dancing, continuous sports play, and sustained spinning, have caused rhabdomyolysis, cardiac events, and fatal collapses in documented cases. Free diving record attempts have produced multiple documented fatalities, including the death of world champion Natalia Molchanova in 2015 during a recreational dive, and the attempts are filmed and shared as adventure content right up until the moment the emergency response begins. The most extreme tolerance records in categories like sustained bee stings have required emergency medical intervention mid-attempt. Historical record attempts in that category have ended in anaphylactic shock requiring hospitalization. The psychological pull of a record attempt, the idea of being the most, or the longest, or the first, activates a risk override mechanism that documented behavioral research identifies as distinct from normal risk assessment and significantly less accurate. The certificate would have been the size of a standard sheet of paper. The medical infrastructure required to manage what the attempt did to the body was considerably larger and contained no certificates at all. 68. The rattlesnake rattle is the warning. That is the entire premise of the arrangement. The snake announces itself. You process the announcement. You back away. The gentleman's agreement holds. Rattlesnakes strike from a coiled position at speeds between 5 and 8 meters per second. The strike travels from coil to contact in approximately 70 milliseconds. The human voluntary reaction time is approximately 200 milliseconds. The math means that evasion after a strike has been initiated is physically impossible, regardless of how prepared you believed you were when you heard the rattle. Approximately 30% of rattlesnake bites involve dry strikes with no venom injection, but this is determined after the fact by medical examination. The person bitten has no way to assess which version they received during the event itself. Decapitated rattlesnake heads retain functional bite reflex for up to 1 hour after death due to residual neural activity, and documented cases of envenomation from the severed head of a snake that was killed by the victim exist in the medical literature. The Mojave rattlesnake produces a neurotoxic venom with delayed onset symptoms, meaning bitten individuals may feel minimal initial pain and believe they were not seriously envenomated before neurological deterioration begins hours later. The warning rattle was genuinely thoughtful. The strike that preceded your reaction time by 130 milliseconds had a different relationship with courtesy. 69. Sleepwalking into hilarious situations is a comedy category with a long and reliable track record. They woke up in the kitchen eating cereal. They tried to have a conversation with the coat rack. They were found outside in the driveway at 2 in the morning with no memory of any of it. Sleepwalkers operate with their eyes open and basic motor function intact, but with zero conscious threat assessment capability, which means they will walk directly toward a staircase edge or out an open window with no protective response engaged at any point in the process. Documented cases of sleepwalkers exiting buildings through second-story windows include multiple fatalities, and the behavior is indistinguishable from purposeful window opening until the fall occurs. The myth that you should never wake a sleepwalker because the shock will harm them is medically false and specifically dangerous, because it is the instruction most likely to prevent the intervention that would stop the person from reaching the hazard. Complex sleepwalking behaviors, including driving, cooking with open flames, and operating machinery, have been documented in the medical literature. Several fatal road accidents have been attributed to sleepwalking drivers. They had no idea where they were going. The staircase at the end of the hall had a very clear understanding of what would happen next, and no mechanism for communicating it. 70. The tongue stuck to the frozen metal pole is a dare so embedded in cultural memory that a major holiday film dedicated a full scene to it, and every child who watched that film immediately understood exactly what would happen, and found it completely hilarious anyway. The adhesion mechanism is immediate sublimation. The moisture of the tongue freezes to the metal surface on contact, creating a bond that releases not by thawing, but by tearing tissue. The wound left behind is equivalent to a significant abrasion. The tongue has an exceptionally rich blood supply, which means tongue lacerations bleed substantially, and in young children who cannot manage the bleeding or position themselves to avoid aspirating it, this becomes a secondary concern requiring adult intervention. The improvised warm water rescue, which is the correct approach, has in documented cases involved panicked bystanders pouring hot rather than warm water, causing burn injury to tissue that is already damaged from the adhesion event. The same physical mechanism applied to bare skin contacting extremely cold metal surfaces has required medical debridement in documented cases, where hand-to-frozen surface adhesion removed layers of skin. The dare lasted 3 seconds. The wound documentation used the phrase tissue avulsion, which is the clinical term for what happens when you lose the argument with frozen steel. 71. Halloween is statistically one of the most dangerous nights of the year for pedestrian fatalities, specifically for children, who are 4 times more likely to be struck and killed by a vehicle on Halloween evening than on any other night of the year. A 2011 study published in the journal Injury Prevention established that figure and identified contributing factors, including dark costumes, impaired vision from masks, and children crossing roads mid-block rather than at intersections. Vision-restricting masks reduce peripheral vision by up to 90% in some designs. The human visual system uses peripheral detection as its primary mechanism for identifying moving vehicle threats. Removing that capability while sending a child into a low-light environment with active vehicle traffic is a specific and documented risk configuration. Dark costumes in low-light conditions have a vehicle detection distance as low as 50 feet. At residential street speeds of 25 miles per hour, a driver needs approximately 100 feet to stop safely after visual detection, which means the detection happens inside the distance required to stop. Costume accessories carried by trick-or-treaters have caused eye injuries to adjacent children and vehicle impact injuries when carried into roadways. You could barely see where you were going. The car that hit you could barely see you at all. Neither party was well informed about the other's presence. 72. Party poppers are handed to children at celebrations because they are the definition of controlled, consequence-free excitement. You point, you pull. You get a small explosion of joy, and the evening continues. The combustion charge in a standard party popper generates a muzzle velocity sufficient to cause corneal injury at close range if the device is aimed at a face rather than upward, and a significant percentage of users aim it at a face rather than upward because pointing it at someone's face is the funniest possible deployment of the device. Documented cases of corneal perforation from party popper projectiles have required surgical intervention. The projectile, typically a small plug or streamer, becomes a penetrating ocular injury at close range, and the eye does not distinguish between a festive delivery mechanism and any other kind. Larger confetti cannons using CO2 cartridges have caused hand injuries from improper assembly and discharge because the pressure required to project confetti across a room is sufficient to cause soft tissue damage if directed at the body during loading. Children's hands that intercept the discharge path of a party popper at close range have sustained abrasion and minor burn injuries from the combustion products. It said, "Aim away" from face in the instructions. The instructions were apparently intended for a different party than the one that was actually happening. 73. Someone has an idea. It is visibly a bad idea. Everyone in the room knows it is a bad idea, including the person who had it. The drink is handed off, and the attempt proceeds anyway. And this is accepted as a cultural institution because the self-awareness of the moment makes it feel like informed consent. Alcohol impairs the cerebellum, which is the brain region responsible for fine motor coordination and balance, at blood alcohol levels as low as 0.05, which is well below the legal driving impairment threshold. The stunt attempted after 2 drinks is being executed by a motor system that is already operating below its baseline capability before the attempt has started. The social reinforcement dynamic of the moment, the audience, the laughter, the challenge framing activates the same dopaminergic reward pathway that makes gambling escalate. The audience is chemically incentivizing the most dangerous version of the attempt by being present and enthusiastic. The combination of alcohol-impaired judgment and audience pressure has been specifically identified in research on recreational vehicle accidents as a contributing social factor in a significant percentage of fatalities reviewed. The beer was held. The beer was subsequently retrieved from a hospital waiting room by someone who had been there for several hours already and was no longer finding the original premise amusing. 74. Latex glove inflation is the universal boredom solution of waiting rooms and examination rooms everywhere. There is a glove. You blow it up. You have created a turkey hand, or an udder, or simply a balloon, and the achievement feels proportionate to the effort and completely without consequence. Latex allergies affect approximately 6% of the general population and up to 17% of healthcare workers. When a latex glove is inflated orally, saliva contact with the latex releases proteins that can absorb through the oral mucosa. In latex-sensitized individuals, this exposure can trigger a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, which is the clinical classification for the category of allergic response that includes anaphylaxis. Bursting a latex glove releases aerosolized latex particles that remain airborne for extended periods. In a clinical setting, this is a significant concern for any latex allergic individual in the room. In a waiting room with children and people whose allergy status is entirely unknown to you, it is an uncontrolled allergen release into a shared airspace. The transition of hospital systems away from latex gloves began in the 1990s, following multiple severe adverse events in healthcare settings. The oral inflation mechanism additionally involves contact with the exterior of a glove that exists in a clinical environment. You made a turkey. 6% of the room was quietly calculating the distance to their epinephrine autoinjector. 75. Don't run with scissors is the most thoroughly mocked parental prohibition in the English language. It has been used as the comedic shorthand for overcautious authority since approximately the moment scissors were invented. The specific danger is not the running. It is the fall and land mechanism, where a trip drives the point of a held sharp object into whatever surface the child's body contacts at the moment of impact, which may be their own torso, throat, or face. Penetrating ocular injuries from sharp objects during childhood falls are documented in pediatric ophthalmology literature. The eye socket offers minimal protection against a forward-pointing sharp object when a child falls face forward because the geometry of the fall directs the point toward exactly that region. Documented cases of scissors penetrating the skull via the orbital cavity. In pediatric falls exist in neurosurgical case literature. These injuries are rare. They are also irreversible, which changes how the probability calculation should be weighted. The prohibition extends with identical logic to pencils, pens, and any forward-pointing object held during movement. Documented pencil impalement injuries to the eye and throat in children who fell while carrying them exist in the same literature. The prohibition sounded like theater. The orbital surgery it was designed to prevent was considerably more specific about what it was for and why. 76 viral physical challenge trends have a consistent internal structure that repeats regardless of the specific content. The algorithm surfaces successful attempts. The injury rate of all attempts is hidden by that selection. The viewer sees 1,000 people succeed, and then they attempt it with a motor skill profile that has nothing in common with the people they watched. The Skullbreaker Challenge in 2020 and the Blackout Challenge in 2021 collectively resulted in multiple documented deaths and serious injuries across the participating age group. TikTok faced lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions following child deaths linked to challenge participation, and those proceedings established that algorithmic amplification of demonstrably dangerous content to minors carries legal exposure for the platform. The survivorship bias mechanism is precisely documented in this context. The platform's recommendation system preferentially surfaces successful attempts. Failed attempts that result in injury are less frequently posted and even less frequently distributed, and the result is a systematically false impression of universal success rates. Spinal injuries from failed gymnastics challenges are a documented category in sports medicine literature, skewing toward individuals with no training attempting elite-level skills. The algorithm showed you 1,000 successful attempts. It did not show you the orthopedic waiting room that formed in the same week from the same sound, and that omission was not accidental. 77. Applying whipped cream to a sleeping person's face is the foundational prank of residential shared living, executed in dormitories and shared houses and summer camps across generations, with a success rate that has made it feel categorically safe. Whipped cream, or any aerosolized substance applied near the mouth and nose of a deeply sleeping individual, can be inhaled during the inhalation phase of the sleep-breathing cycle. Aspiration of dairy content causes aspiration pneumonitis, which is a genuine medical emergency requiring hospitalization, and not a condition that resolves on its own by morning. Dairy allergies affect approximately 2 to 3% of the adult population. Applying whipped cream to the face of a dairy-allergic sleeping person provides a direct mucosal exposure pathway for a known allergen to a person who is unconscious and cannot communicate their allergy status or remove themselves from the exposure. Non-consensual physical contact with a sleeping person is legally assault in most jurisdictions, regardless of the content of the contact or the intent behind it. Multiple documented cases of prank-related charges have involved exactly this category of act. The hand in warm water variant, separately, has caused documented skin maceration injuries in cases where the exposure was prolonged. They were asleep and entirely unable to manage their own airway, their own allergy exposure, or their own legal standing in what you were about to do to them. 78. Novelty shocking gag devices have been in joke shops since electricity became accessible enough to commodify as entertainment. The handshake buzzer, the rigged pen, the controller with the unexpected payload. A little zap, a big reaction, the whole interaction takes 4 seconds and everyone moves on. Individuals with pacemakers and implantable cardioverter defibrillators are specifically counseled to avoid electrical shock sources, because even low-level electrical interference can trigger inappropriate device discharge or inhibit pacemaker function. The person receiving the zap does not come with a label indicating their cardiac device status. Counterfeit and unregulated shocking novelty devices, which are widely available through unregulated online retail channels, have been documented to produce voltages significantly above their marketed output. At least one product recall involved a device producing currents in the medically dangerous range while being sold and labeled as a harmless gag item. The shock response itself, the involuntary muscle contraction, can cause a person holding a sharp or fragile object to produce a grip release injury as a secondary consequence of the primary prank. Individuals with undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmias represent an unknown but statistically non-zero percentage of any group subjected to electrical novelty pranks. The same current that produces a funny reaction in 99 people may trigger an arrhythmia in the 100th. You bought it at a joke shop. That is not a safety certification. 79, a small puncture from a rusty nail gets a Band-Aid and is filed under minor inconvenience, which is the correct response in a world where tetanus vaccination exists and the incorrect response in any world where it does not. Clostridium tetani, the bacterium that causes tetanus, thrives in anaerobic environments. Deep, narrow puncture wounds are ideal because they close over the surface, cutting off oxygen and creating precisely the conditions in which the bacterium produces tetanospasmin, which is the neurotoxin responsible for the disease. Tetanospasmin is one of the most potent biological toxins known to science. It works by blocking inhibitory neurotransmitters in the spinal cord, producing the characteristic trismus, commonly called lockjaw, and generalized muscle spasm. Severe cases produce opisthotonus, where the full body muscle contraction arches the spine backward. The fatality rate for tetanus in unvaccinated individuals in developed countries remains 10 to 20%, even with intensive care. The rust itself is not the pathogen. Tetanus bacteria live in soil and animal feces. A clean nail that penetrated contaminated soil is equally dangerous, and the rust is a surrogate marker for outdoor exposure, not the source of the risk. The Band-Aid covered the entry point. The tetanus bacteria had already moved past the entry point and were working on the anaerobic phase of their residency by the time you put the adhesive down. 80, being pantsed, is in every teen comedy ever produced, and the formula has not changed in 40 years because it works at the same level of reliability every time. The pants come down, the victim scrambles, the crowd erupts, and then the movie cuts to the next scene where everyone is fine and the victim has somehow retained social standing. The tangled ankle mechanism of a pantsing incident is a genuine trip hazard. The victim's pants are around their ankles while they are in motion or reacting suddenly to the situation, which produces a fall mechanism with no protective reflex available because the hands are already occupied with the pants. This combination has resulted in documented knee injuries, wrist fractures, and head injuries in real incidents. Non-consensual public exposure is legally classified as indecent exposure in many jurisdictions, and the classification attaches to the person who caused the exposure, regardless of whether their intent was comedic. At least one documented case exists of a pantsing victim stumbling from the combined effects of the prank and the resulting panic into a roadway, with vehicle contact producing serious injury. The psychological harm of public exposure in school environments has been associated with documented cases of severe anxiety disorder onset and cited in at least one subsequent self-harm incident. The pants came down, the dignity, the ankle, and several legal presumptions came down with them. 81. Novelty stench spray in an enclosed space is olfactory chaos as a precision instrument. You deploy it in the elevator, the classroom, the car, with the windows up, and you wait for the reaction. Commercial novelty stench products typically contain butyric acid, sulfur compounds, or mercaptans, which are compounds the olfactory system identifies as biological contamination signals and responds to with visceral aversion reactions that are partly involuntary and partly indistinguishable from a genuine threat response. Multiple documented cases exist of novelty stench spray deployment triggering school evacuations. In several of those cases, the hazmat teams dispatched to assess the situation cost tens of thousands of dollars in emergency response resources that were billed to the jurisdiction, not to the person who thought the elevator would be a good venue. Individuals with reactive airway disease, including asthma and COPD, can experience genuine bronchospasm from high-concentration aerosolized irritant compounds deployed in enclosed spaces. The spray is not pharmacologically neutral because it is not designed to be. Panic evacuations triggered by unexpected odor events have produced slip-and-fall injuries in documented school and workplace incidents. The injury came not from the spray itself, but from the evacuation response that the spray triggered. The smell was a prank. The $40,000 hazmat response was billed to an actual budget line held by actual people who did not find the premise as compelling as you did. 82. The fairground goldfish in the plastic bag is a childhood milestone, and the bowl on the windowsill is the happy ending. The ping pong ball lands, the fish goes home, a memory is made. Goldfish produce ammonia as a metabolic byproduct. In a small, unfiltered bowl, ammonia concentrations reach toxic levels within 24 to 48 hours. The fish develops ammonia poisoning, exhibits a surface gasping behavior as a distress signal, and dies over the course of days to weeks in a process that is slow and uncomfortable. Common goldfish are not biologically small animals. They grow to 12 to 14 inches in appropriate conditions and live 10 to 25 years with adequate care. The small bowl guarantees developmental stunting and early death regardless of the owner's intentions or attentiveness. Rome passed an ordinance banning goldfish bowls and fair fish prizes. Canada and several European municipalities have enacted similar restrictions based on animal welfare grounds. Pet store data from fair season documents a spike in emergency goldfish presentations in the days immediately following local fair events. The ping pong ball game was the comedy. The fishes remaining 2 weeks in a bowl that was poisoning it with its own waste were a different genre, and that genre has been recognized as significant enough to legislate against in multiple jurisdictions. 83, running full speed into a glass sliding door you did not see, is one of the most perfectly structured comedy moments available in everyday life. The confident approach, the invisible barrier, the spectacular rebound, the expression that cycles through confusion, pain, and recalibration in under 2 seconds. Glass doors and panels cause an estimated 2 million injuries annually in the United States. Impacts with non-safety compliant glass panels, which are present in a significant number of older residential and commercial installations, despite updated building codes, produce large, sharp fragments rather than the small cubed pieces that tempered safety glass generates. The difference between those two outcomes is the difference between a bruise and a laceration that requires vascular surgery. Full speed impact with a glass panel can cause the glass to flex and then shatter inward, generating fragments moving at speed toward the face and torso of the person who just provided the force. Facial and neck lacerations from glass door impacts have required emergency vascular surgery in documented cases involving laceration of cervical vessels. Children running toward assumed open doors are a specifically identified high-risk demographic in Consumer Product Safety Commission documentation on this injury category. The door was funny until the glass was not tempered. After that, the narrative genre shifted without providing any prior notice to anyone involved in the moment. 84. A wild animal approaching you without fear is the kind of nature moment that people describe as magical, as chosen, as a connection with something larger than ordinary life. The deer walked right up. The raccoon let you get close. The fox did not run. Wild animals that approach humans without fear are exhibiting aberrant behavior. Loss of fear of humans is a primary diagnostic indicator for rabies infection, and the raccoon, deer, or fox that walked toward you was demonstrating the cardinal warning sign, not extending an invitation. Rabies post-exposure prophylaxis is effective when administered before symptom onset. Once neurological symptoms of rabies appear, no treatment has produced survival in more than a handful of documented cases in all of recorded medical history. Raccoons are the primary wildlife reservoir for rabies in the eastern United States, and their habituation to human food sources creates a population that regularly approaches humans with exactly the behavioral profile that reads as friendly. The incubation period for rabies is 1 to 3 months, which is long enough that a person who was bitten and did not seek treatment may feel completely fine for weeks before the neurological deterioration begins. The animal came to you. In the risk assessment framework that exists for this specific scenario, that was the entire red flag, not a green one, and no amount of it feeling magical changes the biology. 85, severe caloric restriction before a defined event is a transaction that seems straightforward. Temporary discomfort exchanged for a visible result on a specific date. 2 weeks, dramatic restriction, the event happens, normal life resumes. Refeeding syndrome is a potentially fatal condition, caused by resuming normal nutrition after a period of severe restriction. The mechanism involves rapid cellular uptake of phosphate from the bloodstream when carbohydrates are reintroduced, causing dangerously low serum phosphate. Cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory failure, and death are documented outcomes in clinical refeeding syndrome cases. The event itself is not the dangerous part. The 3 days after the event, when normal eating resumes, is where the physiological crisis occurs, and it occurs in people who are at home, not in medical settings, with no clinical monitoring and no awareness that what they are experiencing is a recognized and potentially fatal syndrome. Severe caloric restriction causes hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia simultaneously, both of which are associated with cardiac arrhythmia independent of the refeeding mechanism. Hypothalamic amenorrhea from caloric restriction and excessive exercise can persist for years after the acute restriction ends because the body's reproductive suppression response to perceived famine does not resolve on the same timeline as the restriction that caused it. The event went well. The refeeding syndrome arrived 3 days later without an invitation and with considerably more urgency than anything on the original schedule. 86. Leaving a child in a running vehicle for 1 minute while you handle a quick errand is a calculation that every parent has made at least once. And the math feels sound because 1 minute is 1 minute, and nothing bad happens in 1 minute. A vehicle interior temperature can rise 19 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 10 minutes with the engine off. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration documents an average of 37 child heat stroke deaths per year in vehicles in the United States. And these deaths occur across all demographics and income levels, because this is not a neglect pattern, it is a physiology pattern. A child's core temperature rises 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's, because their thermoregulation system is significantly less efficient, meaning a child reaches dangerous hyperthermia at ambient temperatures that an adult in the same space would find merely uncomfortable. The intended 1-minute errand has a documented psychological failure mode where cognitive tunnel vision during task completion causes time distortion, and the intended minute becomes 7 without the parent's awareness registering the gap. A running vehicle with a faulty exhaust system, or in a semi-enclosed parking structure, presents a carbon monoxide exposure risk that operates on a completely separate and simultaneous timeline. The minute became 7. The physiology had already made its decision at minute 4 and did not wait for the errand to conclude. 87. Aiming a bottle rocket horizontally at someone as a joke is the most purely chaotic expression of summer available in consumer pyrotechnics, and the fact that it generates a genuine scatter response from everyone nearby is half the point. Firework-to-eye injuries represent approximately 20% of all fireworks-related emergency room injuries, according to Consumer Product Safety Commission data, and the horizontal aimed firework is a specific mechanism category in emergency ophthalmology literature with its own documented injury profile. A bottle rocket traveling horizontally at a human face moves faster than the human blink reflex can protect the eye. The corneal and scleral injuries from direct rocket contact include penetrating globe injuries that require surgical repair and frequently result in permanent vision loss in the affected eye. At least 10 Americans lose an eye annually in fireworks-related incidents, making fireworks the consumer product most consistently associated with permanent sensory organ loss outside of occupational settings. The aimed-at-the-ground version still generates sparks and debris that travel at eye level for anyone within close proximity, because the physics of debris dispersion do not recognize the distinction between intentional and incidental trajectories. You aimed it as a joke. The ophthalmologist documented it as a mechanism of injury. Those are two different descriptions of the identical event, and only one of them appears in any official record. 88. Go-karts are low to the ground, the speeds feel manageable, the collisions are the point of the experience, and the helmet creates a reasonable impression of an engineered safety environment. It feels like bumper cars with slightly better cornering. Go-karts have no crumple zones. The rigid frame transfers impact energy directly to the occupant, with no absorption mechanism between the collision point and the person sitting in the seat. Whiplash injuries from go-kart collisions at speeds as low as 15 miles per hour have been documented in clinical literature because the rigid frame transfer produces force transmission that conventional vehicle engineering is specifically designed to prevent. Spinal injuries from go-kart incidents are documented in sports medicine literature, particularly rear-end collision mechanisms, where the struck driver's spine bears the full impact energy of the contact. Head injuries from cart-to-cart contact at wheel height, where one cart's wheel contacts the side of another at head level, have included skull fractures in documented racing and recreational incidents. Children are particularly at risk because their neck musculature provides significantly less head stabilization during impact, meaning the head moves more violently relative to the torso than an adult's would in the same collision. It was 25 miles per hour with no crumple zones, no seatbelt, and your head at chassis height. Bumper cars have bumpers specifically engineered to prevent every single one of those variables. 89. The movie version of being knocked unconscious is one of cinema's most enduring conveniences. The hero takes a significant blow, goes down, comes back up in a reasonable interval, shakes it off, and returns to full function within the scene. Loss of consciousness from head trauma is a traumatic brain injury event. It is not a dramatic pause with a fixed recovery window. Second impact syndrome occurs when a person sustains a second concussion before fully recovering from the first, and it has a fatality rate of approximately 50%. It occurs exclusively in people who return to activity before the first injury had resolved, which is the precise behavior that the Shake It Off framework models as correct and admirable. The Glasgow Coma Scale, used to assess consciousness after head injury, has 15 points, and any score below 15 indicates neurological compromise. Brief loss of consciousness scores at or below 13, a level that requires medical monitoring and not a return to whatever activity caused the initial injury. Chronic traumatic. Encephalopathy, documented extensively in contact sport athletes, is directly correlated with repeated concussive events, including those involving loss of consciousness. The long-term neurological consequence of the scene where the character shakes it off has a documented disease course measured in decades. The character continued the fight. The neuropathologist reviewed the cumulative result 40 years later and filed a report using different language entirely. 90. The parking boot is an inconvenience delivered in bright yellow, and the indignant walk of shame to pay the fine is a ritual of city living that produces reliable content and universally relatable frustration. Documented cases exist of booted vehicles that belong to individuals who experienced medical emergencies requiring immediate vehicle access for evacuation or transport. The boot created a critical delay in emergency medical response in those cases, and the delay was measured not in inconvenience, but in treatment timeline. The psychological stress of discovering a boot in situations involving urgent time constraints has triggered documented acute stress responses in individuals with cardiovascular conditions, and several cases of stress-related cardiac events following parking enforcement actions have been reported in medical and legal contexts. Illegal private booting operations, which function in some jurisdictions without municipal oversight, have used deliberately obstructive or damaged boots that could not be removed even after full payment, effectively immobilizing vehicles for extended periods beyond the intended enforcement window. Individuals who have attempted to remove boots themselves using force have sustained hand injuries from the clamping mechanism, and in several cases, damaged their vehicle's brake system or suspension components in the removal attempt. It was just a boot. Until the ambulance needed that specific parking space, and the boot had a prior and unresolvable commitment to a different agenda. 91. Watermelon seeds growing a vine in your stomach is parental mythology delivered with complete conviction to children who absolutely believe it for longer than any of them will later admit. The vine is not real. The documented medical concern adjacent to it is. Apple seeds contain amygdalin, a cyanogenic compound that releases small amounts of cyanide during digestion. An ingestion of large numbers of crushed apple seeds has caused documented cyanide toxicity. Date palm seeds, cherry pits, and similar swallowed seed material have caused documented medical presentations, including intestinal obstruction. A fig seed bezoar requiring surgical intervention was documented in a pediatric case, which means the underlying concept the myth gestures toward, indigestible plant material accumulating and causing obstruction, is not fictional. Plant seed aspiration, where seeds reach the airway rather than the esophagus, is a documented cause of pediatric respiratory emergency. Grass seeds and small plant seeds inhaled by children have caused localized lung infections and required bronchoscopic removal. The comedy value of the watermelon vine myth has an ironic medical footnote. It makes all seed swallowing feel uniformly absurd and fictional, which reduces vigilance around the seed hazards that are not fictional at all. The watermelon vine was invented. The apple seed cyanide was not reading from the same script and was not informed of the fictional framing. 92. Duct tape is the universal solution and the universal prank medium simultaneously, and its appearance in a comedic context carries no alarm because it is tape, and tape is tape, and nothing serious has ever been caused by tape. Duct tape removal from skin after extended contact removes the superficial epidermal layer through the same mechanical process as a medical wound debridement procedure. The resulting wound is an abrasion that is painful, prone to infection, and in elderly individuals with fragile skin can constitute a serious injury requiring wound care. Duct tape applied over the mouth, as any kind of restraint creates an airway management emergency if the person vomits, because aspiration of vomit with a taped airway is immediately fatal and cannot be self-resolved by the restrained person. Multiple documented deaths have involved duct tape used as a restraint, including cases where the stated intent was not harmful and the outcome was a fatality anyway, because intent does not modify the physiological outcome of a blocked airway. The viral format of taping a person to a wall has resulted in documented ligature injuries when the taped person dropped from the position and the tape bore body weight through a skin contact point. It fixes anything, except the epidermis it removed, the airway it blocked, and the liability it generated, none of which were fixed by the tape or by the intention behind it. 93. The failed cooking attempt is one of the most reliable formats of relatable content available. The smoke alarm, the defeated expression, the decision to order something instead, the kitchen that survived even if the meal did not. Grease fires are universally mismanaged because the intuitive response is to pour water on a fire, and pouring water on a grease fire causes explosive steam vaporization that sprays burning oil outward, producing a fireball. This has caused documented severe burns and house fires from an intervention that felt completely logical to the person who made it. Cooking fires left apparently contained by removing the pan from heat while the pan is still actively burning have reignited when the owner left the kitchen. Documented fatal house fires have begun as small, apparently controlled cooking incidents that were assessed as resolved and were not. Range hood fires, where accumulated grease in the range hood ignites from cooking vapors below, appear minor from the cook's vantage point, but give the fire direct access to the building structure above the stove within seconds. Carbon monoxide produced by improperly ventilated gas combustion in closed kitchens has caused documented poisoning events in the specific scenario where a failed cooking attempt drives everyone out of the kitchen and away from the ventilation. You ordered the pizza. The grease fire had not ordered anything and was still working through its own agenda for the remainder of the evening. 94. The hand extended from a moving vehicle window is one of childhood's most universally shared sensory experiences. The resistance of the air at speed, the angle that changes the lift, the feeling of something that is neither flying nor falling, but occupies an interesting space between. Extremities extended from moving vehicles have been struck by passing vehicles, road signs, and stationary objects at highway speed, producing traumatic amputations and crush injuries that began as the most straightforward expression of joy possible and ended in an operating room. Side view mirror strikes to hands and arms extended from passenger windows are a documented injury category. At highway speeds, the contact velocity is sufficient to cause compound fractures in the bones of the hand and forearm. In narrow lane situations or when passing large vehicles, the clearance between cars can be measured in inches, and an extended arm in that gap creates a crush injury mechanism with forces that exceed what any hand bone is designed to survive. Road debris at highway speed has documented ballistic properties. A piece of road litter striking an extended hand at 65 miles per hour generates impact energy equivalent to a thrown object. Documented cases of traumatic amputation involving extended limbs from vehicles exist in traffic accident medical literature, and they all began with the window down and someone's hand in the air doing exactly what felt completely natural. 95, the desk nap, the head bob, the startle awake, the brief disorientation before the screen comes back into focus. It is the most universally experienced workplace moment in any profession that involves sitting down for extended periods, and it carries no alarm because everyone has done it and everyone has been fine. The hypnic jerk, which is the involuntary full-body muscle contraction during sleep onset, occurs in approximately 70% of people and has documented outcomes in desk environments including face-to-surface impact injuries, displaced hot beverages causing burns, and activated controls on machinery in safety-critical settings. Drowsy driving kills approximately 6,400 people annually in the United States, according to National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates. The driver who rests their eyes for 1 second at 60 miles per hour covers 88 feet of road with zero input. The same neurological event that produces the harmless desk, Bob produces the fatal highway microsleep, and the brain executing both versions is operating on identical underlying mechanisms with entirely different consequences, depending solely on the environment. Workers in safety-critical monitoring roles who experience desk-level microsleep have caused documented industrial incidents. The head Bob at the desk was harmless. The same reflex executed while operating a vehicle at highway speed had a different relationship with the word harmless, and did not consult the desk version before deciding how to proceed. 96. Energy drinks consumed before physical activity are a documented pre-performance ritual, and the marketing infrastructure around them is built to reinforce exactly that framing. The surge, the sharpened focus, the sense that the body is prepared for something. The FDA has received thousands of adverse event reports linking energy drink consumption to cardiac events. Between 2004 and 2012, Monster Energy was associated with 5 deaths, each involving cardiovascular events in individuals who had consumed the product prior to physical activity. Caffeine at doses found in large energy drinks, ranging from 150 to 300 milligrams per 16 ounces, combined with exercise-induced sympathetic nervous system activation, produces additive effects on heart rate. Both the caffeine and the exercise are telling the heart to accelerate simultaneously. And in individuals with undetected long QT syndrome or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that combined signal can trigger arrhythmias. Energy drinks combined with alcohol produce a state where the sedative effects of alcohol are masked by stimulant activity, while the motor impairment and judgment impairment remain fully intact, which is a specific and documented hazard profile. The American Academy of Pediatrics has issued explicit guidance against energy drink consumption in children and adolescents following documented pediatric cardiac events. The can said it gave you wings. The cardiology report used a different descriptor for the same cardiovascular event and did not find the wings framing applicable. 97. Getting your head stuck in something is the foundational physical comedy premise that generates a guaranteed emergency response call and an equally guaranteed round of stories that improve with every retelling. The railing, the fence, the decorative gate, the ornamental vase that seemed like a reasonable idea at the time. Head entrapment of children in constricting gaps is a documented cause of strangulation death. Children's heads are proportionally larger relative to their necks and shoulders than adults, meaning a child can push their head through a gap that their ears and skull then prevent from being retracted, because the geometry that permitted entry does not permit exit against the resistance of the ear cartilage and the skull's widest points. Positional strangulation from head entrapment occurs when the child's feet lose contact with the floor, and body weight compresses the neck against the entrapping surface. Loss of consciousness from carotid compression occurs within seconds under those conditions, and death follows within minutes. The response time required to survive that scenario is shorter than most fire department response windows. Consumer Product Safety commissioned data documents, cribs, bunk beds, and decorative furniture as recurring head entrapment hazards in children under 5, and multiple product recalls have been issued for gap dimensions outside of established safety standards. It went in fine. The physics of extraction were entirely different, and the time available was considerably shorter than the situation initially appeared to allow. 98. Wild mushroom foraging based on visual comparison to online photographs is presented in food media as a reconnection with something older and more authentic than grocery store provisioning. You found mushrooms. You looked them up. The image matched closely enough, and you made dinner. Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom, is responsible for approximately 90% of fatal mushroom poisonings globally. It is visually similar to several edible species. The toxin it produces, amatoxin, follows a 3-phase clinical pattern. Initial gastrointestinal symptoms appearing 6 to 24 hours after ingestion. A false recovery phase where symptoms appear to resolve between 24 and 72 hours, and then acute hepatic and renal failure between 72 and 96 hours. The false recovery phase is documented as the period in which most victims decline further medical treatment, because they believe they are improving. There is no specific antidote for amatoxin. Liver transplantation is the only definitive intervention in severe cases, and the delay created by the false recovery phase frequently means the patient presents after the transplant eligibility window has closed. Online photograph identification of mushrooms has an error rate that professional mycologists describe as clinically unacceptable, even for expert practitioners using high-quality images. The photo matched well enough to feel confident. The toxin did not consult the photograph before the liver failure began, and the false recovery on day 2 did not mean what it appeared to mean. 99. The planking challenge asked participants to lie face down, horizontally, on increasingly improbable surfaces and document the result. Furniture, vehicles, public infrastructure, anything that made the horizontal pose look more absurd than the last attempt. Acton Beale, 20 years old, died in May of 2011 after falling from a 7th-floor balcony while planking in Brisbane, Australia. His death was widely reported, and the trend paused briefly and then resumed, which is the consistent behavioral pattern following publicized fatalities from viral challenge participation, because the reporting reaches a different audience than the challenge itself. The escalation dynamic of viral physical challenge content is specifically documented in behavioral research. Each successful, extreme attempt creates social pressure to attempt something more extreme, and the comedic framing of the challenge masks the progressive risk accumulation from the participants inside the trend. Planking on moving vehicles created a documented road hazard category, where the person planking on a moving truck bed or car roof could fall into active traffic. Several near-miss and injury incidents were documented in that subcategory before the trend cycle ended. The psychological mechanism that drove planking escalation is structurally identical to the mechanism that drives every subsequent viral physical challenge, regardless of the specific content, which is why the documented pattern repeats with different aesthetics and the same injury profile. The challenge was to lie still on a balcony railing 7 floors up. Stillness and that specific railing had a fundamental disagreement about the terms. 100 near-miss compilation videos are their own genre, built on the premise that watching resolve danger is entertainment because the danger was resolved. The car that almost crashed. The shelf that fell 1 second after the person walked under it. The outcome was fine, which is why you are watching it, which is also why it is funny. Heinrich's triangle is a foundational occupational safety model, proposing that for every fatal accident, there are approximately 29 serious injuries and 300 near-miss events with the same root cause. Near-miss events are not resolved danger in the safety engineering framework. They are unaddressed danger that has been granted an extension. Viral near-miss videos filmed in industrial settings frequently document OSHA violations and unsafe working conditions simultaneously, and several viral near-miss videos have been used as direct evidence in subsequent fatal accident litigation from the same facilities because the conditions that produced the near-miss were documented on camera and not corrected. The normalization effect of near-miss entertainment, where repeated exposure to survived danger reduces the viewer's threat assessment of equivalent scenarios, has been documented in experimental psychology as desensitization to risk cues. Aviation near-miss incidents are mandatory safety data investigated as potential fatal events. The entertainment industry's framing and the aviation industry's framing describe the identical event using frameworks that are completely incompatible with each other, and only one of those frameworks has ever prevented a subsequent fatality. 101. The blooper reel promises that every mistake ends with laughter, that the outtake is the human truth behind the polished product, and that the gap between the scripted version and what actually happened is where the genuine joy lives. Film and television production sets are among the most statistically dangerous workplaces in the entertainment industry, and the blooper reel is specifically engineered to not show you that. Brandon Lee died on March 31st, 1993, during the filming of The Crow, when a bullet fragment lodged in a prop gun discharged during a scene. The genre of funny prop gun moment and the genre of fatal set accident are separated by exactly one mechanical variable that is invisible to everyone watching and occasionally to everyone present. The shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of Rust in 2021 reignited a debate about live ammunition protocol that has existed continuously since John Eric Hexum died on a set in 1984 and has not been resolved in the 4 decades between those two events. Stunt performer deaths occur in the production of exactly the action content that appears in trailers as the reason to buy a ticket. Occupational injury rates in film and television production exceed those of several industries that are conventionally understood as dangerous. The blooper reel shows what survived the editing process. The union safety report covers the part that did not make the final cut, and that part is why the blooper reel exists in the shape that it does. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.